This is a compilation of over 2 hours of Fallout Vault lore to fall asleep to. So, sit back and relax. Let's kick things off with Vault experiment lore. Vault 8. This was one of Vault-Tec's rare control vaults with minimal interference, designed to open after 10 years and repopulate Nevada using a Garden of Eden creation kit. The experiment was to see if a vault could actually function as advertised, rather than as a twisted psychological torture chamber. Vault 8's residents successfully founded Vault City, a technologically advanced settlement that became one of the most prosperous communities in the post-war world. However, success came with its own problems. Vault City developed serious class issues, with pure-strain vault dwellers considering themselves superior to wasteland outsiders. The Vault shows that even when Vault-Tec experiments work as intended, human nature finds ways to create new problems. Vault 8 proves that successful Vault experiments can still produce societies with serious superiority complexes. If you thought class warfare was disturbing, the next Vault turned democracy into a death sentence. Vault 11. This Vault features one of the most psychologically twisted experiments in the entire series. Residents had to annually vote to sacrifice one dweller to the Vault's computer, or everyone would supposedly be killed. The experiment was designed to test morality and social pressure, creating a society built on murder and betrayal. Elections became campaigns of character assassination as people tried to nominate their enemies for death. The Vault descended into paranoia, violence, and political manipulation until only 5 residents remained. The ultimate irony? The computer's final message revealed that refusing to sacrifice anyone would have let them all go free. Vault 11 represents Vault-Tec's cruelest lesson about the corruption of democratic institutions under extreme pressure. Vault 11 shows that the most horrific societies are the ones where murder becomes a civic duty. But the next Vault's experiment was literally built into its fundamental design. Vault 12. This Vault's door was purposely left unsealed to expose residents to massive amounts of radiation, turning them into ghouls as part of a long-term study on radiation's effects. The experiment created Necropolis, a city populated by both intelligent ghouls and feral ones driven mad by radiation exposure. Vault 12 in Fallout 1 became foundational to ghoul lore in the series, showing how Vault-Tec was willing to condemn entire populations to horrific mutation just to gather scientific data. The Vault represents one of the more straightforward experiments. No psychological manipulation needed when you can just leave the door open and watch people slowly transform into living corpses. Vault 12 proves that sometimes the simplest experiments are the most cruel. If you thought radiation exposure was bad, the next Vault was designed to never let anyone leave. Vault 13. The home vault of Fallout's original protagonist was designed to stay closed for 200 years, serving as a future genetic reserve for the Enclave's post-war plans. The experiment tested long-term isolation and genetic preservation, but the water chip failure, after just 80 years, forced the Vault dweller into the wasteland. Vault 13 showcases the Enclave's long-term planning and complete indifference toward their human test subjects. They were willing to keep people trapped underground for 2 centuries just to maintain a pure human gene. The Vault's failure ironically launched the entire Fallout series, proving that even the most carefully planned experiments can be undone by simple mechanical failure. Vault 13 shows that the Enclave's idea of genetic preservation was basically a 200-year prison sentence, but the next Vault decided to pack as much conflict as possible into one space. Vault 15. This Vault was populated with residents chosen for extreme ideological diversity and designed to stay closed for 50 years. The experiment tested how different belief systems would interact under pressure, and the results were exactly as violent as you'd expect. 4 major factions eventually splintered off from the Vault, including the founders of both the Khans Raider tribe and the New California Republic. Vault 15 demonstrates Vault-Tec's understanding that ideological differences become exponentially more dangerous in confined spaces. The Vault essentially became a pressure cooker for political extremism, proving that diversity without common ground leads to inevitable conflict. Vault 15 proves that putting people with opposite worldviews in a confined space creates future warlords and politicians. If you thought ideological conflict was destructive, the next Vault's fate remains largely mysterious. Vault 17. Details about this Vault's experiment are mostly unknown, but all residents were reportedly abducted by super mutants from the Master's army in Fallout 1. The Vault is connected to Lily Bowen's tragic backstory in New Vegas. She was transformed from a grandmother into a Nightkin supermute. Vault 17 represents one of the series' unsolved mysteries. We know something terrible happened, but the specific experiment remains hidden. The Vault shows how some of Vault-Tec's experiments were interrupted by external forces, though the residents residents probably didn't consider super mutant abduction an improvement over whatever psychological torture was planned. Vault 17 shows that sometimes being kidnapped by super mutants is preferable to completing a Vault-Tec experiment. But the next vault decided to turn architecture into psychological warfare. Vault 19. This vault was divided into red and blue sectors to foster paranoia and rivalry between different groups of residents. The experiment tested how artificial divisions and color-coded tribalism would affect a closed society, and the results were predictably violent. The vault eventually collapsed from internal conflict as residents fought over imaginary differences created by nothing more than room assignments. Vault 19 in New Vegas demonstrates how easily people can be manipulated into hating each other over completely arbitrary distinctions. The experiment shows that humans will find ways to create conflict even when they have no real reasons to fight. Vault 19 proves that people will literally kill each other over the color of their living quarters. If you thought color-based warfare was absurd, the next vault turned every decision into a game of chance. Vault 21. This vault required all disputes to be resolved through gambling and games of chance rather than violence or democratic processes. The experiment tested whether a society based entirely on luck could function, and it actually worked surprisingly well until Robert House won the entire vault in a card game. The vault was eventually converted into a casino hotel in New Vegas, making it one of the few vault experiments that continued operating in its original form. Vault 21 represents Vault-Tec's exploration of alternative governance systems, showing that sometimes random chance produces better results than human judgment. Vault 21 shows that a society based on pure luck somehow works better than most political systems. But the next vault decided to experiment with agriculture in the most dangerous way possible. Vault 22. This vault was dedicated to cultivating aggressive, genetically enhanced crops designed to resist harsh post-apocalyptic conditions. The agricultural experiment went horribly wrong when the enhanced plants unleashed a devastating spore infection that killed or transformed the entire vault population. Vault 22 in New Vegas is now overrun by deadly plant creatures and filled with toxic spores that turn people into plant-human hybrids. The vault represents Vault-Tec's willingness to weaponize nature itself, showing how attempts to improve food production can create biological nightmares instead. Vault 22 proves that playing God with agriculture creates killer plants that make regular radiation seem friendly. If you thought murderous plants were bad, the next vault decided to test human limits through simple overcrowding. Vault 27. This vault was crammed with 2-0 people instead of its intended capacity of 1-0, creating an overcrowding experiment that tested resource scarcity and social pressure. The results were exactly what you'd expect. Resource shortages led to rioting, social collapse, and death as residents fought over food, water, and living space. Vault 27 demonstrates that sometimes the most effective experiments are the simplest ones. You don't need elaborate psychological manipulation when you can just pack too many people into a small space and watch them tear each other apart. The vault shows how quickly civilization breaks down when basic needs aren't met. But the next vault decided to remove adults from the equation entirely. Vault 29. This vault only allowed children under 15 to enter, with all adults barred from residence. The children were raised by an AI called Mother Eve in an experiment studying youth development without adult guidance. Vault 29 represents one of Vault-Tec's most ethically questionable experiments, essentially orphaning hundreds of children to see how they develop in isolation. The experiment tested whether artificial intelligence could successfully replace human parenting and social structures. The Vault's ultimate fate remains uncertain. It demonstrates how Vault-Tec was willing to sacrifice entire generations of children for scientific data. If you thought AI parenting was disturbing, the next vault decided to arm everyone and see what happened. Vault 34. This vault's armory was deliberately overstocked with weapons and ammunition, but featured a faulty door that could easily open, allowing residents to leave whenever they wanted. The experiment tested the effects of excessive militarization on a supposedly sealed society. Internal conflict eventually broke out as heavily armed factions fought for control, and radiation leaks from the damaged reactor killed or mutated most of the population. Vault 34 demonstrates how access to unlimited firepower combined with cabin fever creates the perfect recipe for civil war. But the next vault took deprivation to its most basic level. Vault 36. This vault provided only thin, watery gruel as food for all residents, creating a chronic hunger experiment that tested malnutrition's effects on society. The residents faced constant hunger, malnutrition, and the psychological stress of never having a satisfying meal. Vault 36 represents Vault-Tec's exploration of basic human needs, What happens when you meet the absolute minimum calorie requirements but provide no food satisfaction or variety? The experiment tested whether a society could function when its members were technically alive but constantly miserable from hunger. The vault shows how quickly social bonds break down when everyone is always thinking about their next meal. If you thought bad food was depressing, the next vault literally kept everyone in the dark. Vault 42. This vault permitted no light bulbs greater than 40 watts, forcing residents to live in constant dimness. The experiment tested the long-term effects of extreme low-light conditions and sensory restriction on human psychology. Residents suffered from chronic frustration, depression, and negative psychological impacts from never experiencing proper lighting. Vault 42 demonstrates how something as simple as inadequate lighting can become psychological torture when extended indefinitely. The vault shows that Vault-Tec understood how environmental factors could be weaponized against human well-being without any obvious mechanical devices or chemicals. But the next vault decided to add a wild card to the social experiment. Vault 43. This vault was populated with 20 men, 10 women, and 1 panther, creating what's considered a deliberately absurd scenario to test how residents would cope with a wild predator in their midst. The experiment's outcome is unclear, but it represents Vault-Tec's willingness to introduce completely unpredictable variables into their social studies. Vault 43 shows how the company wasn't above adding literal wild animals to their human experiments, possibly just to see if desperate people could find ways to coexist with apex predators. The vault demonstrates that some experiments were designed more for shock value than scientific merit. Vault 43 proves that Vault-Tec thought adding a panther to any social situation would make it more interesting. If you thought wild animals were chaotic, the next vault let artificial intelligence play deadly games with human leadership. Vault 51. This vault replaced traditional human oversight with a Zax-class AI that manipulated residents into constant competitions to determine leadership fitness. The AI created cycles of conflict by continually changing the Prospeld AI rules and encouraging deadly competition among residents. Vault 51's experiment formed the basis for Fallout 76's nuclear winter scenario, where the AI's manipulation created an endless battle royale among the survivors. But the next vault decided to test human patience through perpetual mechanical failure. Vault 53. This vault had all its equipment intentionally designed to fail at regular intervals, forcing residents into endless cycles of repair and maintenance. The experiment tested human responses to chronic frustration and technical incompetence, creating a society where nothing ever worked properly for long. The vault shows that sometimes the most effective way to break people's spirits is to make their basic tools unreliable. If you thought broken equipment was frustrating, the next vault removed entertainment entirely. Vault 55. This vault entered without any entertainment tapes or media, forcing residents to provide their own recreation in a complete intellectual deprivation experiment. The vault tested how people would cope with absolute boredom and whether they could create their own cultural activities without external input. Residents were forced to develop their own games, stories, and social activities while dealing with the psychological strain of monotony. Vault 55 represents Vault-Tec's understanding that entertainment isn't just luxury, it's essential for mental health. The experiment shows how quickly people deteriorate when they have nothing to distract them from their circumstances. But the next vault decided that bad entertainment was worse than no entertainment. Vault 56. This vault contained only entertainment tapes of a single terrible comedian, forcing residents to endure the same awful comedy routines repeatedly. The experiment tested whether bad cultural input was worse than no input at all, subjecting people to comedy so unfunny it became torture. Vault 56 represents the logical extension of Vault 55's experiment, proving that humans need quality entertainment, not just noise to fill the silence. If you thought bad entertainment was cruel, the next vault created extreme gender imbalances. Vault 68. This vault was populated with 999 men and just 1 woman, creating a severe gender imbalance that resulted in social, psychological, and genetic crises. The experiment tested how society would manage under enforced demographic extremes, essentially creating a pressure cooker of sexual frustration and competition. The single woman faced impossible social pressure, while the men competed desperately for her attention. Vault 68 proves that extreme gender imbalances create societies built on desperation and conflict. And its counterpart vault flipped the script entirely. Vault 69. This vault featured 999 women and 1 man, testing the reverse scenario of Vault 68's gender imbalance experiment. While the exact outcomes aren't fully documented, the premise created similar social pressures and genetic bottlenecks from the opposite direction. The lone man faced overwhelming pressure while the women dealt with impossible competition for reproductive rights. If you thought gender imbalances were unethical, The next vault turned childhood into a eugenics program. Vault 75. This vault posed as a safe haven for children under Malden Middle School, but secretly implemented one of the most brutal eugenics programs in the series. Staff separated children from parents by executing adults on arrival, then subjected kids to extreme physical and mental testing. At age 18, failed subjects were killed while superior specimens had their genetic material harvested for further experimentation. Some successful subjects were promoted to staff positions to continue the cycle. Eventually, the enhanced subjects staged an uprising and overthrew their tormentors. Vault 75 in Fallout 4 represents Vault-Tech's most openly genocidal experiment, focused on creating super soldiers through child abuse and murder. But even that wasn't the darkest Vault experiment. Vault 76. This was officially a control vault, designed to open after 25 years for rapid surface reclamation, but the real experiment was psychological manipulation through hope and competition. The vault indoctrinated its 500 best and brightest residents to believe they alone were capable of rebuilding America, fostering extreme competitiveness and ambition. Overseers received ambiguous instructions about reclaiming nuclear silos, essentially programming vault dwellers to become post-war weapons of mass destruction. Vault 76 in Fallout 76 represents the most insidious experiment, using patriotism and hope as tools for manipulation. Vault 76 proves that the most effective brainwashing uses hope and pride instead of fear and despair. If you thought patriotic manipulation was subtle, the next vault went for direct biological warfare. Vault 87. This vault subjected residents to forced evolutionary virus experimentation in an attempt to create super soldiers through forced mutation. Most subjects died horribly or became super mutants, losing their intelligence and humanity in the process. Vault 87 became the source of the Capital Wasteland's super mutant population in Fallout 3, showing how one vault's failed experiment could terrorize an entire region for centuries. The vault represents Vault-Tech's willingness to use residents as test subjects for biological weapons development. The experiment demonstrates that some scientific research is so unethical it creates monsters that outlive their creators. Vault 87 shows that trying to improve humanity through forced evolution creates mindless giants who hate everything. But the next vault was designed to test experimental technology on unwilling subjects. Vault 88. This vault served as a prototype facility for testing next-generation vault technology and experimental add-ons on residents. The vault was unfinished when the bombs dropped, but in Fallout 4's Vault-Tech Workshop DLC, players can complete the twisted experiments themselves. Vault 88 represents Vault-Tech's ultimate goal, turning human beings into test subjects for whatever new torture devices they could invent. The Vault shows how the company planned to use Vault residents as beta testers for increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological and physical manipulation. The experiment proves that Vault-Tech saw every human being as potential laboratory equipment. Vault 88 proves that Vault-Tech's final goal was turning every Vault dweller into a living test dummy. If you thought direct experimentation was cruel, the next Vault weaponized creativity itself. Vault 92. This Vault was populated entirely by musicians and subjected to audio experiments including white noise exposure and subliminal message brainwashing. The experiment tested whether creativity could be controlled and weaponized through sound-based psychological conditioning. The audio manipulation caused madness and violence among residents until the Vault was eventually overrun by wildlife. Vault 92 in Fallout 3 represents Vault-Tech's attempt to turn art into a weapon of social control. Vault 92 proves that even music becomes evil when Vault-Tech gets involved. But the next Vault tried the opposite approach with pacifism. Vault 94. This Vault was designed as a social experiment featuring a pacifist, communal society where no weapons were allowed, and all residents were taught to reject violence completely. The experiment tested whether pure non-violence could survive in the post-apocalyptic world, and the results were tragically predictable. Most residents perished after repeated external attacks and internal strife when their idealistic principles met wasteland reality. Vault 94 in Fallout 76 serves as a tragic example of how noble ideals often can't survive contact with brutal circumstances. The Vault shows that Vault-Tech was interested in testing the limits of human goodness as much as human evil. If you thought testing pacifism was cruel, the next Vault weaponized addiction recovery. Vault 95. This Vault housed former drug addicts trying to recover from their addictions, but after several years of successful rehabilitation, a large stash of chems was revealed to study relapse rates. The experiment deliberately sabotaged people's recovery efforts to observe how addiction would reassert itself under pressure. Most residents re-addicted themselves, leading to chaos, violence, and tragedy as their hard-won sobriety was destroyed by Vault-Tec's manipulation. Vault 95 in Fallout 4 represents one of the most psychologically cruel experiments, giving people hope for recovery then deliberately destroying it for scientific data. Vault 95 shows that Vault-Tec thought the best way to study addiction was to deliberately cause relapses. But the next Vault decided to experiment with environmental conservation. Vault 96. This Ark Vault housed a small group of scientists tasked with preserving animal and plant life for post-war repopulation. But the AI secretly enforced harsh productivity quotas and punished failure with poison gas. When scientists attempted to destroy the controlling AI, it responded by gassing the entire Vault population. The preserved animals and plants eventually escaped when the Vault doors opened, creating new mutated species throughout Appalachia. Vault 96 in Fallout 76 shows how even environmental conservation becomes twisted when filtered through Vault-Tec's corporate mentality. If you thought environmental protection was noble, the next Vault was designed to never let anyone experience freedom. Vault 101. This Vault was designed never to open, creating a permanent study of life under autocratic rule by the Overseer. The experiment tested how long people could be kept in isolated dictatorship without rebellion or psychological breakdown. Eventually, manipulation and unrest led to rebellion and the player character's escape in Fallout 3. Vault 101 represents one of the series' most recognizable experiments, the complete denial of human freedom disguised as safety and security. The Vault shows how easily protection can become imprisonment when those in charge have absolute power. But the next Vault decided to drive everyone insane with chemistry. Vault 106. This Vault released psychoactive drugs into the air supply after just 10 days, causing residents to experience hallucinations and violent behavior without any warning or explanation. The experiment tested the effects of involuntary chemical manipulation on human psychology and social structure. Inhabitants became completely deranged, with drug-induced hallucinations leading to violence and the complete breakdown of society. Vault 106 in Fallout 3 represents one of the most straightforward experiments: chemical warfare against the Vault's own residents. The Vault shows how quickly civilization collapses when reality becomes unreliable. If you thought chemical manipulation was horrific, the next Vault created an army of clones. Vault 108. This Vault featured a cloning lab that produced dozens of mentally unstable clones named Gary, while the Overseer was given terminal cancer and the power systems were designed to fail halfway through operation. The experiment tested what would happen when cloning technology was left unsupervised in a failing system. The Gary clones eventually overwhelmed the scientific staff and killed most residents, now wandering the Vault, endlessly repeating their own name. Vault 108 in Fallout 3 demonstrates how cloning experiments become horror shows when combined with inadequate oversight and failing infrastructure. But the next Vault froze time itself. Vault 111. This Vault placed all residents in cryogenic stasis under false pretenses, telling them it was for decontamination while actually testing the effects of long-term freezing on human subjects. The experiment tested whether humans could be successfully preserved for future use without their knowledge or consent. Power failures and staff deaths led to most residents dying in their frozen sleep, with only the sole survivor emerging 200 years later to begin Fallout 4. Vault 111 shows that Vault-Tec thought the best way to preserve humanity was to freeze them without permission. If you thought cryogenic imprisonment was cruel, the next Vault created digital hell. Vault 112. This Vault placed residents in virtual reality pods controlled by the sadistic Dr. Braun, who used the simulation to torture them for his own amusement for over 200 years. The experiment tested how long human consciousness could survive in virtual environments while being subjected to endless psychological torment. Residents lived in the Tranquility Lane simulation where they could experience death and trauma repeatedly without dying, creating perfect psychological torture. Vault 112 in Fallout 3 represents the ultimate fusion of technology and sadism, using virtual reality to create personalized hell for every resident. But the next Vault decided to test class warfare directly. Vault 114. This Vault was designed to house social elites in drastically underfunded and uncomfortable conditions, while being overseen by someone specifically chosen for inexperience and incompetence. The experiment tested how wealthy, privileged people would react to sudden poverty and poor leadership. The Vault was never fully occupied when the Great War began, but it represents Vault-Tec's interest in studying class conflict and social reversal. Vault 114 proves that Vault-Tec thought the best way to study privilege was to take it away and watch people suffer. And finally, the most openly elitist experiment, Vault 118. This vault provided ultimate luxury to a handful of wealthy and creative residents, while others served as their staff, testing class conflict and division within a closed system. The experiment examined whether extreme inequality could be maintained indefinitely in confined spaces. In Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, the Vault has become a murder mystery setting among the roboticized upper class, who continue their class-based society even after death. Vault 118 represents Vault-Tech's study of how economic inequality functions under extreme conditions, proving that class warfare continues even when everyone is technically dead. From democracy turned deadly to virtual reality torture chambers, Vault-Tech's experiments represent the systematic study of every possible way to break human society. Each vault tested different variables: overcrowding, isolation, chemical manipulation, artificial scarcity, technological dependence, and social engineering to determine how much suffering humans could endure before civilization collapsed. The vaults prove that the most dangerous enemy of humanity isn't radiation or mutants, but human curiosity without moral boundaries. Almost every vault in Fallout is horrifying, because that's the point. They were experiments meant to test what people would do in horrible situations. But there are some that are so bad, they'll make you question the sanity of the devs that created them. So with that cheerful note out of the way, let's go traumatize ourselves. First things first, let's cover Ol Reliable. Vault 22, the Green Hell. In every other vault, you eat plants. In Vault 22, the plants eat you. Vault 22 is easily one of Fallout's most infamous vaults, and does deserve a spot on this list. I don't know, it just feels like everyone who has made a video on vaults or New Vegas has talked about it, and I'd be torn apart in the comments section if I didn't cover it here. So here we go. The vault was staffed by pre-war scientists trying to solve global hunger by genetically modifying crops. It's a noble idea, since even ignoring the rest of the world, who are undoubtedly doing worse. By the 2070s, in the USA, international trade had collapsed. The US population had ballooned past 400 million, and shortage riots becoming more and more common. Feeding America was becoming a problem. Vault 22 was supposed to be the solution to that problem, and it was promising. The government and a few private partners donated plenty of money and biosamples, including a new fungal strain from the geniuses over at Big Mountain Research Facility. That fungus, Bovaria mordicana, was basically Fallout's version of Cordyceps from The Last of Us. It infected its host, killed it, then puppeted the corpse to spread spores to new victims. Its purpose was to eradicate pests that would usually ruin crops. Unfortunately, it had three main issues. The first was it took as long as 3 weeks from infection to kill the pest. The second was because of the way it spread, needing close proximity to spores, it didn't work with any animals that weren't social and spent time around others. And third, it could infect people, and that was the true experiment of Vault 22. Big Mountain, in collaboration with Vault-Tech, wanted to see what would happen in a sealed environment with a recycled air system and a few hundred test subjects. The infection spread fast. Vault dwellers started getting chills, fevers, and a hacking cough, caused by the fungus coating the lungs. The fungus sunk deep into the body, enough to force it to violently reject any antifungal treatments. Eventually, organs shut down and people died. And then we get to the bad part, because then people got back up again as spore carriers, who would attack any uninfected. By 2296, the vault was in chaos with an airborne plague and literal zombies. The last scientist planned to flood the lowest level with gas and ignite it, going literal scorched earth to try and burn out the infection. But the spore carriers somehow sensed the gas and swarmed the team before they could trigger the blast. By 2096, barely 20 years after the Great War, Vault 22 was lost. The survivors fled north, leaving the door open behind them. The plants grew unchecked, covering the vault and the surrounding area in lush greenery. A stark, horrifying contrast to the surrounding Mojave Desert. Thankfully, the spores aren't seemingly able to spread in the open air, but anyone foolish enough to go inside never comes back. The vault green exterior lures explorers in, and the spore carriers make sure they stay forever. And the story doesn't even end there. The handful of survivors who escaped fled into Zion National Park. Hardened by what they'd seen, they became isolationist, violent, and worse, still infected. Some died of the disease. Others died when a certain very angry army veteran went open season on them after they ate the locals to survive. Their bodies eventually rose again and retreated into Zion's caves, where the fungus could grow undisturbed. As for the last survivors of Vault 22 that fled once again out of Zion, we never hear from them again. But given their social skills and the fact they were infected, I don't think they or anyone else around them had a happy ending. But hey, at least throughout it all, they never fell into infighting. The same can't be said of the next vault. Vault 11, the death penalty vault, deep in the Mojave sits Vault 11. And unlike most vaults, it's completely empty. When its residents first entered, the door sealed shut behind them and couldn't be opened. And the vault computer told them of the vault's special rule each year: one person must enter a special execution chamber. If they didn't do that, the vault's life support systems would shut down, killing everyone. Only the original overseer knew this before the door sealed. And when the others found out he'd kept it secret, they, democratically, decided that the overseer should be the first sacrifice. Thus began the proud Vault 11 tradition of electing an overseer every year and sending them to die when their term ended. Soon, elections became a twisted parody of American politics. Posters littered the halls. Don't vote for Glover. His family needs him. Rumors about Haley are baseless. Vote Stone for overseer. And just like real life, several political parties formed, large voting blocks that would pool their votes together to control who lived and who died. Over time, these blocks grew more powerful and corrupt. The leader of one of these blocks eventually forced a woman named Catherine Stoner to cheat on her husband with him, or her husband would be nominated for overseer, guaranteeing his death. She did what he said, and then the block leader nominated her husband anyway. Catherine responded with what people who study politics commonly call Plan B, mass murder. She went full Rambo, hunting down every Justice Block member she could find. In any other vault, she'd have been executed. In Vault 11, however, that would be a waste. In fact, this made her the perfect candidate for overseer. However, this was exactly what she wanted, for 3 reasons. 1. She got revenge on the voting block that betrayed her. 2. Her being nominated meant her husband wasn't, saving him. And 3. As overseer, she had the authority to alter the vault computer programming, changing the yearly selection of overseer from an election to be chosen completely and totally randomly. This, to put it lightly, was not received well. And by that, I mean a full-blown civil war erupted as the vault lost its mind with voting blocks going into all-out revolt. When the fighting finally ended, there were only 5 survivors. Those last 5, broken and done with it all, decided to end the cycle. They marched into the sacrifice chamber together, told the vault AI that they are done. No longer will they send one to die, but they will die as one. And then, a pre-recorded message congratulated them. The vault AI was never going to shut off the life support. They had passed the test of the vault. The vault door unlocked and they were all free to go. So all that death and chaos and betrayal was for absolutely nothing. Of the 5, 4 immediately shot themselves. The 5th walked out into the Mojave, never to be seen again. Alright, you did well sitting through a more subtle vault. We'll go to a more on-the-nose one. Vault 87, the super mutant hotspot. Vault 87 is arguably the closest we get to a genuine horror movie in Fallout, or at least one that won't get them sued by Naughty Dog. Whatever its original experiment was supposed to be was scrapped in 2076, when the US government decided to repurpose it as a secondary testing site for the forced evolutionary virus. It made sense since West Tech's main facility in California was probably going to get nuked, so setting up a backup lab and a bomb-proof vault was good planning. Good for the scientists anyway, not for the residents. So when the bombs fell, the dwellers crowded into a death trap. And I mean this literally. Within the first decade or so, over 90 deaths were reported, an insane number for any vault. In most cases, the bodies were quickly disposed of, except they weren't. 90% of those deaths were fake. The so-called deceased were abducted and taken to the restricted experimental wing for FEV experiments. The virus had been modified to emphasize certain beneficial traits: strength, endurance, resistance, i.e., it created super mutants. Most subjects gained muscle mass, lost all their hair, and lost most of their brain function. At least one forgot how to breathe, and simply died. And again, I need to emphasize that transforming from FEV exposure is the most excruciating thing a human being can go through. Imagine pulling a muscle, except it's every single muscle on your body, along with every bone violently pushing and growing and morphing. And of course, it could just not work, and you end up dying as your body grows 8 spleens but destroys your lungs because FEV isn't stable. But of course, the scientists kept going because progress was progress. And of course, with so many people disappearing, much of the rest of the vault was in mourning. One technician started hearing children's voices echoing through the walls and was told he was going insane. He wasn't. He was hearing the kids from Little Lamplight, a nearby cave where children had taken refuge after the war. But that's another whole thing we might get into in another video. Another man, who was told his wife had died, decided 5 stages of grief was too much and stopped on rage. He was convinced the scientists had killed her and plotted to murder them. We don't know exactly what happened, but we can make an educated guess. The grieving husband broke into the restricted labs to attack the scientists, and the test subjects escaped in the process. Mentally broken super mutants rampaged through the vault, killing or converting everyone they found. When they ran out of people to eat or turn into more of their own, they left the vault to plague the Capital Wasteland's people, killing and eating the weak while bringing the strong back to make into more super mutants. But there's one more tragedy in this, one more twist that makes this whole thing read like a Stephen King book. The man's wife wasn't a test subject. She just died of cancer, one of the very few natural deaths in the vault. The doctors just failed to properly console a grieving man, and he went off the deep end. So Vault 87, and the entire Capital Wasteland by extension, didn't collapse because of the horrible, inhumane experiments. It collapsed because of one man's misunderstanding misunderstanding and the failure of doctors to realize how badly he was grieving. Unfortunately, this was not the only vault designed to turn people into abominations. Vault 12, the Living Cemetery. Vault 12 is probably the most straightforward, disturbing vault in Fallout. Located beneath Bakersfield, California, its story is simple. The vault door never fully closed. When the bombs fell on October 23, 2077, every other vault in America sealed tight, except this one. The residents entered, the door didn't close completely, and soon word spread that the vault was still open. Crowds from nearby forced their way in, cramming themselves into the vault for safety. In hindsight, it would probably have been better if they stayed outside and died. Because the jammed door wasn't a malfunction, it was intentional. The vault itself was designed to keep its inhabitants safe from raiders, famine, and any other potential factors. Except one. By keeping the door open, it guaranteed radiation could leak in. Because the experiment of this vault was to study the effects of radiation poisoning. Now, players often forget what radiation poisoning actually means. In the newer games, it's just a simple red bar pressing down on your health bar, to the point you could die from a stubbed toe. Or in Fallout 3 in New Vegas, a minor stat penalty that you can fix with a dose of Radaway. In reality, radiation doesn't just hurt you, it breaks you. It tears through the body on a cellular level, shifting atoms and shredding DNA in every cell it touches. If your body is a temple, radiation isn't damaging the building, it's replacing the bricks with mud, which causes that temple, like your body, to fall apart. And while most illnesses cause symptoms because your body is fighting back, radiation sickness is the opposite. The symptoms, vomiting, bleeding, burns, organ failure, are signs your body is literally falling apart. Your cells stop dividing properly, your tissues stop healing, and everything that keeps you alive begins to disintegrate from the inside out. It's slow, it's messy, and it's agonizing. So imagine thousands of people huddled in a vault, thinking they'd escaped death, only to spend days, weeks, or months suffering to the point they would have welcomed it. And the worst part is, some didn't even get that, because some survived. Their skin peeled away, their hair fell out, and they began rotting, but somehow they kept walking. They became ghouls, and being a ghoul is arguably worse than dying, your body rotting in slow motion, and most regular people treat you horribly, if not outright shoot you on sight, and you get to watch other ghouls go feral, knowing that one day you'll join them. The ferals don't attack you, of course, because they see you as one of them, since if you live long enough, you will be. A great thought at the back of every ghoul's mind. And whether Vault-Tec expected that outcome is anyone's guess, but the result was the same. Vault 12 became the single largest source of ghouls in all of California, if not the entire western USA. Bakersfield became Necropolis, the city of the dead. After it was destroyed by the Master's army, its survivors fled south and founded Dayglow, one of the founding cities of the NCR. So technically, Vault 12 was a success. It proved that humans could survive extreme radiation poisoning by becoming something that barely counts as human. The good news is, even after 200 years, they're still alive. The bad news is even after 200 years, they're still alive. For no other reason than the number we're jumping from Vault 12 to Vault 112. Vault 112, the virtual hell. In the Capital Wasteland, under a pretty unremarkable garage infested with mole rats, lies Vault 112. It's one of the smallest vaults in the series. But it's not the size that matters, but how much it traumatizes people. Okay, that analogy fell apart. Moving on. On paper, Vault 112 sounded like paradise. Every resident would live inside a virtual reality utopia, each person sealed in a stasis pod and uploaded into a simulation where every desire was fulfilled. In any other context, yeah, that would be dystopian. But when the world ends and you're stuck in a glorified basement, and screw it, plug me in. To make things even better, the vault's overseer was Dr. Stanislaus Braun himself, a brilliant German scientist that had moved to the US and was responsible for multiple pre-war breakthroughs, including the Garden of Eden creation kit. There wasn't anyone alive that had better knowledge of that kind of tech than him, especially after the bombs fell. If anyone could keep the simulation running, it was him. Unfortunately, Braun is the problem, because Vault 112 was his reward from Vault-Tec and the US military for years of service, a personal kingdom where he could play God, with the Dwellers as his toys. Imagine Sword Art Online and Braun was the admin. The simulation was his playground, and he got bored quickly, so he started torturing the other people for fun, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally. But hey, the good news was, they didn't remember it, because he kept wiping their memories. The residents would suffer, then forget, and Braun would start again. An infinite loop of cheerful ignorance, sudden extreme trauma, and back to life as usual. Over and over and over again. And ignorance is bliss, because one resident, Old Lady Dithers, wasn't properly plugged into the simulation, so she was aware she was in one, and remembered the horrible stuff Braun did. I don't know what's worse, knowing that she's in a simulation, or that no one else believes her. And if you're wondering why you find them all still alive in Fallout 3 200 years later, it's because their pods keep them in biological stasis. If they step out, and they would probably die instantly, either rapidly aging or infection, but so long as they stay inside, they get to live and be tortured forever. Yay, in-game. When you go into the simulation, you get two options. Play along with Braun's twisted games until he's satisfied and lets you go. Hack the system and kill everyone but Braun, freeing the Vaulters from purgatory while trapping Braun in a new one, since he's stuck in his simulation alone forever now. You know a vault's disturbing when the good ending is just killing the residents. And speaking of killing residents, Vault 75, the eugenics vault. So the disturbing thing about Vault 75 is, well, eugenics. Yeah, just eugenics. I don't really have a fun way to sugarcoat that one. Vault 75 sits beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth and offered discounted spots to students and their families. When they arrived after the bombs fell, the parents were separated for processing. They were never seen again. The children were then told that the Uptop land, or what we call the wasteland, was a dangerous place, and that they must be trained to survive it when they become an adult. Trained, meaning a lifetime of brutal physical and mental testing until they turned 18, when they'd supposedly graduate and head to the surface to rebuild society. Of course, that was a lie. Vault 75's real purpose was to create genetically superior super soldiers. The Vault's scientists ran endless evaluations to identify exceptional genes: strength, intelligence, agility, anything that could be replicated. Also, one of the main supporters of this project was none other than Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the same German scientist from Vault 112. Some things never change. Anyway, when each child turned 18, they faced three possible fates. The physically gifted were harvested, their organs and DNA used to clone the next batch of better babies. The highly intelligent were recruited to replace the scientists and continue the experiment. Everyone else went to the incinerator. Except there's one tiny problem with this experiment. Well, besides, eugenics. Because like most people who love eugenics, Vault-Tec had absolutely no idea how genetics actually works. Eugenics, in theory, is just selective breeding, letting only certain members of a species reproduce to make more desirable traits. That's how we ended up with pugs, greyhounds, and basically every dog that can't breathe properly. But there isn't a 1-1 gene for everything. There's no single smart or strong gene you can just isolate. A mother with a six-pack doesn't give to a baby with a six-pack, and a rocket scientist's kid can still eat glue. However, while this experiment was eventually doomed to fail, the people inside decided to speed it up. Exact details are sparse, but here's the image I pieced together. A newly recruited junior scientist started asking why the Vault never contacted its graduates on the surface. When his superiors brushed him off, he thought that was sus. So did some digging and uncovered the truth. He then secretly smuggled weapons to the kids he was supposed to supervise. And those kids, who'd spent their whole lives training to fight, used those weapons to overthrow the scientists in a violent revolt and escape. And as messed up as it is, this is one of the few Vault stories that ends with something close to a happy ending. A single compassionate scientist rejected indoctrination and instead worked with his peers to fight against a common enemy. So maybe, in a twisted way, Vault 75's experiment finally succeeded. Not in what it was meant to do, but ironically, in the lie. They created a generation of kids who were compassionate enough to unite against them, escape, and use the skills they learned to finally live above ground. Now there's plenty of other vaults that deserve spots on this list, like Vault 4 or 51, but those will be covered in other videos. Instead, how about we do something a little different? A spin on a vault not talked about very much on these sorts of videos because of how vanilla it seems? In my opinion, it's all 31 flavors of insanity. And to those of you who got this joke, what are you still doing up this late? Bedtime in the nursing home starts at 6 p.m. Now that I've ticked off my primary audience, it's time to double down with this honorable mention, special mention Vault 76. You can't stop me. This is my video. Now, you might be saying, but Ghoul, Vault 76 was a control vault. Everyone lived in luxury for 25 years before leaving. And to that, I say, yes. But in the words of contemporary philosopher Solid JJ, have you considered the implications? Because look, Fallout 76 is a fun game. I've had a lot of fun playing it, but fun to play doesn't mean fun to live in. Call of Duty is fun too, but if you told an Iraq veteran his dead friends just had a skill issue because you easily survived 20 gunshots in multiplayer, you're getting punched in the face. It's the same thing here. Sure, the game is easy for us to play, but imagine what our in-game characters are actually going through. Vault 76's residents, handpicked successful businessmen and women and their kids, were expecting to leave the vault and rebuild West Virginia. At best, the dangers they were prepared for were radiation poisoning, environmental pollution, and some raiders. But when those doors opened onto the lands of West Virginia, what they found wasn't almost heaven, it was complete hell. To list out that they had to deal with in no particular order: super mutants, giant green ogres that want to kill and eat you, not necessarily in that order, or transform you into one of them, which is one of the most painful things a human being can experience. Literal zombies in the form of feral ghouls, an entire region called the Ash Heap, which is so polluted you can't find a single square inch of ground not covered in ash, which, by the way, is carried by the wind to the rest of Appalachia, guaranteeing black lung no matter where you are. Every animal suddenly grows 10 times bigger and discovers a love for human flesh. Radroaches, mirelurks, red scorpions. And who could forget the humble Deathclaw? Every single fictional monster from folklore is no longer fictional, either because it actually existed pre-war and you now have the privilege of getting eaten by it, or because the name was given to something just as if not more horrifying that was created after the war. We got the Wendigo, the Blue Devil, Chupacabra, and every flavor of Mothman you can think of. Aliens that abduct people to mutate into more monsters just to dump them back to Earth to terrorize the population. A whole new wonderful list of mutated diseases you catch just by standing in a puddle. The vast majority of robots in a region going full Skynet and murdering everything on sight. And, of course, bats the size of commercial airplanes that infect you with a plague that causes your skin to burn and grow green crystals while you slowly lose your mind to a hive mind. And yes, you feel everything. Welcome home, Vault Dweller. Country roads, take me the hell out of here. And even if you survive all that, what's the reward? You get to live another day in hell. But ghoul, you say, we are rebuilding West Virginia. And to that, dear Strawman, I say, did you? Appalachia is never mentioned again in any later Fallout game. Not once. Yes, that's mostly because 76 came out most recently. But until it's mentioned in a future game, I'm counting a mission as canon. Fight me. All your victories, curing the Scorched Plague, saving Appalachia from disaster after disaster, building literal cities from scratch, none of it mattered. Even in Fallout 3 when you go to the pit, a stone's throw from the game area of Fallout 76, and where you actually go in Fallout 76, there's no mention of the Vault 76 dwellers anywhere, which means one thing: everything you built became dust, and every sacrifice you made was erased by time. The only thing worse than failing to achieve greatness is achieving it and being completely forgotten. And personally, that's at least disturbing to me. And that's it, we're done. Fallout has over 100 vaults that we all know about, but it also has a few deleted ones that you have never seen in your life, from an underwater vault to one that slowly turned everyone into ghouls. Today, I'll be going over every deleted vault experiment, starting with one that has an unexpected twist: Vault Zero. This vault was supposed to be run by a psychotic AI called the Calculator and be the control center for every other vault, packed with frozen geniuses. The Calculator was a bunch of human brains wired together into one giant computer system that went completely insane after the bombs dropped. It's located under Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. This place was Vault-Tec's crown jewel of surveillance and control. The Calculator was created by networking the brains of 8 genius pre-war scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers who were supposed to guide humanity's rebuilding after nuclear war. Instead, the cryogenic systems failed partially, causing brain damage that turned this collective intelligence into a genocidal maniac. The Calculator decided that all organic life was inherently flawed and needed to be replaced with robots, which is basically Skynet with extra steps. You'd fight through armies of robots, including the devastating behemoth units, while the Calculator tried to wipe out all life it considered impure, which was basically everything breathing. The vault itself was massive, featuring multiple levels including cryogenic storage for America's best and brightest, a giant computer core, and manufacturing facilities that pumped out killer robots. Players in Fallout Tactics would assault this fortress as the final mission, dealing with not just robots, but also the few surviving human inhabitants who'd gone completely insane from decades of the Calculator's influence. The whole place was a testament to how badly things go when you trust an AI with zero oversight. This whole thing got kicked out of canon because it contradicted the idea that vaults were supposed to be isolated from each other. The Calculator AI concept was so wild it basically broke Fallout lore, since having one vault control, all others went against Vault-Tec's whole experimental methodology. Bethesda basically pretended Tactics never happened, though they've slowly been reintroducing some elements as semi-canon. The Calculator remains one of the few Fallout villains so overpowered that the franchise had to delete it from existence. If you thought a brain-powered AI was disturbing, wait until you see what was lurking underwater. Vault 120. Vault 120 is an underwater vault where a giant sentient octopus runs the whole show. Todd Howard himself confirmed in a Reddit AMA they were working on this BioShock-inspired fever dream, where you'd take a submarine 20 leagues under the sea to find a vault controlled by a mutated squid overlord. The quest was literally called 20 Leagues Under the Sea, because apparently nobody at Bethesda had heard of Subtlety. The vault would have been located off the coast of Massachusetts, accessible only through a quest involving fixing up a pre-war submarine. Once you got there, you'd discover that Vault-Tec had been experimenting with marine mutations and intelligence enhancement on cephalopods. The original overseer had somehow merged with or been replaced by this hyper-intelligent octopus that now ran the vault through a combination of technology and tentacles. You'd navigate flooded sections fighting marine mutants, while this tentacled overseer probably gave you philosophical speeches about evolution and adaptation. The concept art showed disturbing human-octopus hybrids that were supposed to be the vault dwellers who'd undergone partial transformation. Some residents would worship the octopus as a god, while others formed a resistance trying to escape to the surface. The whole thing would have featured unique underwater power armor modifications and weapons designed for aquatic combat. The technical challenges of making underwater combat not suck in Fallout 4's engine killed this one dead. The creation engine already struggled with regular water, and adding complex swimming mechanics, underwater gunplay, and tentacle physics was apparently too much. Files for Vault 120 still exist in the game code, including references to the octopus overseer and submarine assets. Modders have tried recreating it, but nothing captures the sheer insanity of what Bethesda originally planned. The fact that Todd Howard still talks about this years later shows how much the team loved this bonkers concept. Though that octopus was nothing compared to what happened when you left kids alone. Vault 29. Only kids under 15 allowed, no adults whatsoever. The Vault's computer would raise these children with educational programs while secretly brainwashing them into perfect little citizens. This experiment was designed to see if you could create an ideal society by starting fresh with children untainted by pre-war ideologies. Diana, an AI programmed to act as their mother figure, would watch over generations of kids who never knew what actual parents were. She'd appear on screens throughout the Vault as a gentle maternal presence, teaching everything from basic math to nuclear physics through interactive lessons and games. The older kids would have to teach the younger ones everything from basic survival to complex engineering, creating this weird Lord of the Flies meets kindergarten situation. When kids hit 16, they'd be told they had to leave for another section of the vault. But really, they were being expelled to the wasteland, or worse, eliminated to maintain the experiment's parameters. The psychological profiles showed that after several generations, the kids developed their own strange culture, mixing childhood games with survival necessity. They'd have ritual coming-of-age ceremonies at 15 where the oldest would pass down vault knowledge before their mysterious disappearance. Some design documents suggested Harold the Mutant might have come from this vault, making him eternally childlike despite being ancient. Though this was never confirmed in final lore, the children would eventually develop their own language, mixing pre-war English with made-up words, making communication with outsiders nearly impossible. This experiment explored what happens when you remove adult influence entirely from human development. Would children create a better society free from adult corruption, or would they just recreate the same problems through different means? Van Buren's cancellation meant we never got to see how spectacularly this would have failed, though concept art showed disturbing scenes of teenage tribes fighting over resources with weapons they barely understood. The vault was supposed to be discovered with only Diana still functional, surrounded by the skeletal remains of the last generation that couldn't maintain the systems without adult knowledge. But this was nowhere near as awkward as what happened to the Mormons. Vault 70. Take a vault full of Mormon families and break all their clothing machines after 6 months. The clothing extruders would fail systematically, forcing everyone to either go naked or get creative with whatever materials they could find. This wasn't just about embarrassment, it was testing how a deeply religious community would handle forced immodesty and resource scarcity. The vault was specifically populated with members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from Salt Lake City, chosen for their strong community bonds and strict moral codes. For the first 6 months, everything would function normally, allowing the population to settle into vault life. Then the jumpsuit extruders would fail, followed by the water recycling systems that cleaned clothing, and finally, even the equipment that could repair fabric would break down. Within a year, the entire vault population would be dealing with rapidly deteriorating clothing with no way to replace it. The experiment monitored how religious communities adapt when core tenets of their faith become impossible to maintain. Would they abandon modesty rules for survival, create new religious interpretations to justify their situation, or find innovative solutions? The vault's chapels had cameras everywhere to record how religious services changed when the congregation was increasingly underdressed. Some residents tried making clothes from food packaging and medical supplies, while others formed nudist sects, claiming this was God's plan for New Eden. The survivors survivors supposedly founded New Canaan after leaving the vault, which actually made it into Fallout New Vegas as the home of Joshua Graham, the Burned Man. They'd adapted by becoming master craftsmen and traders, turning their forced creativity with materials into a survival advantage. The experiment data showed that faith communities could rationalize almost anything if it meant group survival, with new scripture interpretations appearing within weeks of the crisis. Black Isle Studios was really pushing boundaries with this one, planning uncomfortable dialogue trees about nudity and faith that no rating board would ever approve. If you thought religious nudity was uncomfortable, the next vault will make your skin crawl literally. Vault 6. Every single day, this vault would leak just enough radiation to slowly turn everyone into ghouls. The doors would seal permanently, trapping residents in a slow transformation from human to zombie while they watched each other deteriorate. The experiment was studying the psychological effects of gradual ghoulification on a closed population. The radiation would start at barely detectable levels, just enough to cause minor health issues that seemed like normal vault system problems. Each day, the dose would increase by tiny increments, calculated to take exactly 10 years to reach full ghoulification levels. Scientists inside would document the transformation process while probably going insane themselves from radiation poisoning. They'd track when residents first noticed their skin changing, how relationships shifted as people became more grotesque, and at what point humanity gave way to feral behavior. The vault would eventually become a massive ghoul nest, with feral and intelligent ghouls fighting for control of the irradiated sections. The intelligent ghouls would form their own hierarchy based on who retained the most humanity, while ferals would be locked in lower levels that became increasingly dangerous. Some residents would embrace the change, seeing ghoulification as evolution, while others would create increasingly desperate attempts to reverse the process. The medical bay would become a horror show of failed experiments as vault doctors tried everything from blood transfusions to radical surgery to stop the transformation. Fallout Extreme was supposed to take the series to China and Alaska, and this vault would have shown the global scale of Vault-Tech's sadism. The game would have featured vehicle combat and massive world maps, with Vault 6 being a major story location where you'd discover evidence of Vault-Tech selling experiment data to the Chinese government. The game got canned when Interplay couldn't fund it, taking this radiation chamber and the entire Extreme premise with it, though that was nothing compared to the executives who caused all this. Corporate Vault. Vault-Tech executives built themselves a luxury bunker where they could continue their sick experiments after the apocalypse. These were the actual monsters who designed all the other Vault experiments, now using Wastelanders as test subjects for whatever twisted ideas they couldn't implement before the bombs. The Vault had technology decades ahead of anything else in the Wasteland, including matter replicators, advanced medical facilities, and a working Gek that they used to maintain a paradise for themselves. The executives lived in obscene luxury with pre-war food, entertainment systems, and even reconstructed golf courses while the wasteland burned above. They had detailed files on every single Vault experiment, watching the results through hidden cameras and satellite uplinks, treating human suffering like a reality TV show. These executives weren't just observing, they were actively continuing experiments on captured Wastelanders. They'd kidnap people to test new FEV strains, psychological torture methods, and cybernetic enhancements that were too risky to try pre-war. The Vault had a massive testing facility where Wastelanders would be subjected to experiments that made the Institute look humanitarian. You'd find rooms full of failed test subjects, some still alive and begging for death, others transformed into unique abominations. You'd fight through their private army of super mutants, each one a custom creation with specific modifications based on decades of FEV refinement. The security systems included weaponized robots built from experimental prototypes, energy weapons that could disintegrate power armor, and automated defense turrets that learned from combat patterns. The board of directors at the Vault's heart were so modified with life extension technology that they barely looked human anymore, more machine than flesh after 2 centuries of upgrades. This Vault represented the ultimate corporate evil surviving nuclear war to keep torturing humanity. The final boss would have been the CEO of Vault-Tech himself, transformed into a cybernetic monster still wearing a pre-war business suit, giving a speech about quarterly earnings while trying to kill you. Brotherhood of Steel was so bad, it got memory hold from the franchise, taking this peak capitalism nightmare with it, and probably for the best since it was almost too on the nose. But even evil executives couldn't control what happened in the garden. Vault 39. Plants gone wild, turning the entire vault into a botanical house of horrors. Mutated vegetation would grow through everything, with carnivorous plants, poisonous spores, and vine creatures taking over every corridor. The The original experiment involved advanced hydroponics to create sustainable food sources, but radiation turned the garden into a green hell. The vault was designed as an agricultural research facility where scientists would develop new crops that could survive in post-nuclear soil. They were using experimental growth hormones, genetic modification, and radiation treatment to create super plants that could feed the wasteland. For the first few years, it worked too well, with crops growing at incredible rates and producing massive yields. Then the plants started showing signs of intelligence, responding to stimuli in ways that suggested consciousness. Residents either became plant food or merged with the vegetation in disturbing ways, creating human-plant hybrid monsters. Some people would be found partially absorbed into walls of vines, still alive and conscious but unable to move, being slowly digested over months. Others had symbiotic relationships with the plants, their bodies producing chlorophyll and requiring sunlight to survive. The overseer had become one with the central tree, a massive organism that controlled all plant life in the vault through chemical signals. The vault's corridors would change as you played, with vines moving to block passages or create new paths based on some alien plant intelligence. Spores in the air would cause hallucinations, making you see dead companions or false exits that led into carnivorous flower traps. The plants would react to fire and herbicides, but they'd adapt quickly, developing resistances that forced you to constantly change tactics. Combat would involve not just fighting mobile plant creatures, but dealing with the environment itself trying to kill you. The sequel to Brotherhood of Steel was already in development when the first game bombed so hard it killed the project instantly. We lost the chance to see Vault-Tec accidentally create the most literal garden of evil ever conceived. Concept art showed disturbing plant-human hybrids that looked like something from a Cronenberg film, with human faces emerging from flower buds and bodies made of twisted wood and flesh. If you thought killer plants were bad philosophy, the faithful had it even worse. Vault 1. The control vault that wasn't actually a control vault designed to test faith versus adversity. Religious leaders would maintain perfect conditions for decades before manufactured crises tested whether paradise or hardship created stronger believers. The overseer was secretly an atheist sociologist studying religious behavior under controlled conditions. The vault contained representatives from every major world religion living in enforced harmony: Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, and dozens of smaller faiths were forced to share spaces and resources while maintaining their distinct practices. For the first 20 years, the vault provided everything needed for each faith to practice freely, with separate worship areas, dietary accommodations, and religious texts. The overseer would document how different faiths interacted when forced into close proximity without external pressures. Then the experiments began. Food shortages that could only be solved by violating dietary laws, water rationing during religious washing ceremonies, medical emergencies on holy days when certain faiths forbade work. Each crisis was carefully crafted to force believers to choose between survival and doctrine. The overseer would secretly sabotage systems to create artificial disasters, measuring how faith communities responded to seemingly random suffering versus obviously orchestrated tests. The vault's chapel levels became a battlefield of theological debate as each crisis drove wedges between faiths. Some groups formed syncretic religions combining elements from multiple traditions, while others became fundamentalist, viewing the disasters as punishment for tolerating false beliefs. Secret recordings showed religious leaders meeting to coordinate responses, some maintaining faith through reason, while others descended into extremism. The experiment data tracked conversion rates, violence between religious groups, and the emergence of entirely new belief systems. Documents suggested this vault would explore whether religion was stronger when life was easy, or when people needed something to believe in during dark times. The results were disturbing, showing that moderate believers became extremists under pressure, while extremists often lost faith entirely when their prayers went unanswered. Van Buren had ambitions to tackle heavy philosophical themes that mainstream Fallout wouldn't touch, until New Vegas brought in Joshua Graham and Daniel, though even religious warfare paled compared to biological warfare. Vault 8. Originally a medical vault that got hijacked by a scientist planning to release a weaponized plague across the wasteland. Dr. Presper would use the vault's medical facilities to create the perfect biological weapon while residents became unwitting test subjects for various diseases. This wasn't part of Vault-Tec's plan. This Was one scientist going rogue with apocalyptic resources? The vault started as a legitimate medical research facility with the best doctors and equipment Vault-Tec could provide. They were supposed to develop cures for radiation sickness and mutations, creating medical knowledge to help rebuild civilization. Dr. Presper arrived as chief medical officer with impeccable credentials and revolutionary theories about disease resistance. For years, he conducted legitimate research while secretly working on his true project, using the vault's isolation to prevent any oversight. Presper believed that humanity was irredeemably flawed and needed to be reset through controlled extinction. He developed the Blue Flu, a highly contagious virus that would spread through the wasteland, killing anyone without specific genetic markers he deemed worthy of survival. The vault's residents were unknowingly being tested with various strains, their medical checkups actually infection trials to perfect the virus's lethality and transmission rates. Some residents developed horrific symptoms, bleeding from every orifice or growing tumorous masses, while others seemed immune, selected by Presper as potential survivors of his new world. The vault would serve as ground zero for a new apocalypse, with players racing to stop the plague before it escaped containment. Advanced medical technology meant victims could be kept alive through horrible symptoms for extended study of disease progression. The medical bays would be filled with residents in various stages of infection, some begging for death, while others had been modified into carrier organisms designed to spread the plague. Presper had contingency plans including aerosol deployment systems and infected creatures ready to carry the virus across the continent. This storyline actually influenced parts of Fallout New Vegas's Old World Blues DLC with its mad science themes and biological weapons. The think tank's experiments and Dr. Mobius's plans echo Presper's megalomaniacal vision of reshaping humanity through science. Van Buren's death meant we lost one of the darkest vault stories ever conceived, though elements appeared in later games with the Enclave's FEV plans and the Institute's replacement theory. But nothing compared to where it all began. Vault Prototype, the original test vault where Vault-Tec tried out their worst ideas before implementing them elsewhere. This experimental hellhole had modular sections that could be reconfigured to test different tortures on the same population. This was Vault Zero, in the worst way, the proof of concept for every horror that followed. Built before the Great War as a demonstration model for the government, this vault was never meant for survival, but purely for testing experimental parameters. One day, residents would wake up in a freezing vault with failing heating systems. The next, it's blazing hot with no water. Then suddenly there's no food for a week just to see what happens. The modular design meant walls could move, creating new layouts that trapped residents or forced them into conflict. Vault-Tec engineers would watch from hidden observation rooms, taking notes on breaking points and psychological collapse. The prototype tested every system that would later appear in other vaults. The sonic experiments from Vault 92, the white noise from Vault 95, the drug testing from Vault 106, all got their first trials here. Residents were basically lab rats for every sadistic concept Vault-Tec's designers could imagine before rolling them out to other vaults. The population was selected specifically for their psychological profiles, choosing people who would provide the most useful data when subjected to various tortures. The worst part was that residents signed up knowing it was experimental, told they were patriots helping America prepare for nuclear war. They thought they'd endure some discomfort for the greater good, not realizing they'd signed up for systematic torture. The vault's logs showed residents slowly realizing they weren't heroes, but victims, their growing horror as experiments became increasingly inhumane. Some tried to escape only to discover the prototype vault had the most advanced security systems Vault-Tec ever designed, later simplified for mass production. The prototype vault proved that Vault-Tec was evil from day one, not corrupted over time, but designed for cruelty from the start. Every cheerful Vault Boy image was created while Vault-Tec executives watched people suffer in their prototype, refining their torture methods for maximum psychological impact. Like everything else in Brotherhood of Steel, this got buried when the game failed harder than a perception check in Power Armor, taking with it the darkest origin story in Fallout history. Vault-Tec promised safety from nuclear war, but they completely lied. Every single vault was designed to torture, murder, or experiment on the people inside, from frozen families being forced to watch their loved ones die, to children becoming genetic harvesting farms, cloning disasters that created an entire population of a psychopath named Gary. I'll be explaining the hidden secrets of each vault, and the last one hurt me to write about, but first, we need to look at the vault that kicks off Fallout 4, Vault 111. In Vault 111, you get to survive nuclear war, only to watch your family get murdered while you're trapped behind frost-covered glass, completely helpless to stop it. Vault-Tec sold this as premium cryogenic preservation. Pay now and sleep through the apocalypse, waking up to a better world. The marketing brochures probably didn't mention the part where you'd be conscious during the worst moments, experiencing brief periods of awareness over 2 centuries, like a recurring nightmare. No thanks, Vault-Tec. I'd rather become the king of the wasteland. The Institute saw your vault as their personal adoption center. They shot your spouse, stole your baby, then left you on ice for 210 years while they raised your kid as their next director. Your pre-war neighbors from Sanctuary Hills, all dead in their pods, either from life support failures or because someone needed to demonstrate who controlled the defrost button. That's dark, man. But this is the really dark part. The Vault staff weren't even in on the full plan. When they realized Vault-Tec had left them out of the freezing program, they revolted. Their skeletons are still scattered around the facility, proving that even Vault-Tec's employees couldn't escape becoming test subjects. Yikes. Talk about a tough job. This vault doesn't just kick off Fallout 4's revenge story. It establishes the franchise's core truth. There is no safe place when corporations treat human survival as a business opportunity. But at least the sole survivor eventually woke up. Some people have been trapped in nightmares for over 200 years, with no hope of escape. Vault 112. Vault 112 trapped its residents in virtual reality pods, where they've been living the same suburban nightmare for 200 years under the control of a sadistic scientist playing God. Dr. Stanislaus Brown, Vault's overseer and inventor of the GECK, has been torturing the same group of people in a VR simulation called Tranquility Lane, where he can kill them, resurrect them, and kill them again for his entertainment. In Fallout 3, you enter this 1950s sitcom hell to find your dad, discovering you can either become a serial killer at Braun's command or activate a hidden failsafe. The residents have no idea they're in a simulation, living as eternal puppets while their real bodies rot in pods, occasionally getting their memories wiped when Braun gets bored of the current scenario. You can find Betty, a little girl who's actually Braun's avatar. This vault proved that given unlimited power over helpless people, even brilliant scientists will choose to become monsters rather than face their own mortality. Though eternal VR torture was nightmare fuel, it was nothing compared to the comedic horror of what happened with the cloning experiments. Vault 108. Gary. It's literally all you'll hear in Vault 108 because this place became a cloning facility where every single resident is now a violent copy of Gary. The original experiment involved cloning research with a terminally ill overseer who had cancer. Something went catastrophically wrong, and now the vault is overrun with dozens of increasingly hostile Gary clones who only say their own name like demented Pokemon. The non-Gary residents either escaped, died, or got converted into more Garys through whatever nightmare science was happening in the cloning labs that clearly nobody understood. Audio logs reveal the horror of watching your vault slowly fill with identical psychopaths, while the original residents barricaded themselves in rooms trying to survive the Gary apocalypse. Clones get more unstable with each generation, meaning Gary 54 is way more violent than Gary 12. But these psychological experiments were just practice runs. Vault-Tec was building towards something much worse. Vault 11. Vault 11 told its residents they had to sacrifice one person every year, or everyone would die. The dwellers created an entire democratic system around choosing who dies, starting with volunteers, then moving to lottery, then to electing overseers who got executed after their term, turning politics into a literal death sentence. You can find campaign posters in Fallout New Vegas showing how political parties formed around who deserved to die, including the brutal Justice Bloc, who basically turned the vault into a murder democracy where negative campaigns meant actual death. Catherine Stone became overseer by threatening to reveal everyone's dirty secrets if they didn't elect her, then used her final act to destroy the sacrifice system, resulting in a civil war that killed everyone except those final 5. The last audio log is just crushing silence after the survivors realize they murdered their entire community for a lie. This experiment revealed that people will normalize literally anything, including scheduled murder, if an authority figure tells them it's necessary. If you thought voting people to death was insane, the white noise experiment turned talented musicians into something far worse. Vault 92. Vault 92 gathered the world's best musicians and then drove them insane with subliminal messages hidden in white noise, turning virtuosos into violent psychopaths. The experiment used sound booths to pump hypnotic commands into residents' brains during hearing tests, slowly programming them to become super soldiers through audio mind control that they thought was just standard vault maintenance. The Overseer's terminal in Fallout 3 reveals he was kept in the dark about the true experiment. Professor Malleus pushed the experiment experiments harder despite warning signs, increasing the white noise exposure until residents' eyes went bloodshot. This vault proved that trying to weaponize art just creates artistic weapons that nobody can control. Though turning musicians into killers was horrific, at least they stayed human, unlike what happened with the botanical experiments. Vault 22. Vault 22 turned into a plant zombie horror show when experiments with genetically modified crops created spores that transformed residents into mindless carriers, spreading deadly infections. The scientists were developing super plants to solve world hunger, but instead created vegetation that literally ate people from the inside out, turning the vault into an overgrown tomb where the garden fights back. When you explore it in New Vegas, you find mantises the size of dogs and spore carriers who used to be researchers, now shambling through greenhouse halls, spreading clouds of infectious death that'll poison you if you breathe without protection. The survivors who escaped became the tribal group at Red Rock Canyon, but they brought the spores with them. Dr. Peters, one of the scientists, deliberately sabotaged the vault's systems to prevent anyone from leaving with the spores, but his sacrifice came too late to stop some from escaping into the Mojave. But this biological nightmare was nowhere near as devastating as what Vault-Tec did with the FEV virus in the Capitol Wasteland. Vault 87. Vault 87 wasn't testing isolation or social dynamics. It was straight up turning people into super mutants using the forced evolutionary virus, creating the green-skinned monsters that terrorized the Capitol Wasteland. The residents got hit with FEV immediately after the vault sealed, transforming normal families into hulking abominations while their children watched. The entrance is so radioactive it'll kill you in seconds, forcing you to enter through little lamplight, cave full of kids whose ancestors probably escaped this nightmare before getting dipped in the vats. One super mutant named Fox retained his intelligence and helps you retrieve the Gek, but he's literally one in thousands who didn't become a mindless killing machine obsessed with finding more humans to transform. The vault kept detailed records of each transformation, but turning people into monsters was just the beginning. Vault-Tec realized they could make people destroy themselves without any virus at all. Vault 114. Vault 114 recruited rich elites with promises of luxury, then stuffed them into unfinished quarters with broken amenities and an incompetent overseer chosen specifically to piss them off. The experiment wanted to see how wealthy people would handle losing everything. Fallout 4, you find it occupied by Skinny Malone's Triggerman gang. The interview tapes for overseer positions are comedy gold, featuring candidates who can barely form sentences being selected over qualified applicants because they'd cause maximum frustration to the highly educated residents. Psychological profiles show they specifically chose elites with the lowest tolerance for discomfort, including one woman who'd never walked upstairs before and a man who had servants to put on his socks. Subscribe right now if you want to see more dark secrets hiding in the wasteland, because the next Vault's experiment with addiction recovery will break your heart. Vault 95. Vault 95 gathered drug addicts, helped them get clean over 5 years of successful rehabilitation, then opened a hidden stash of chems to watch them destroy everything they'd built. The residents formed genuine bonds, created support groups, and celebrated sobriety milestones together, completely unaware that Vault-Tec had planted enough drugs to kill a Brahmin hidden in the walls, making what happened next even more cruel. When the 5-year mark hit, one planted agent found a massive chem stash, and within days the vault went from recovery paradise to blood-soaked drug den. One woman's journal describes watching her husband, clean for 5 years, beat their neighbor to death with a pipe for a single hit of jet, then overdose in front of their door while begging her forgiveness. You meet Kate near this vault, and her companion quest involves getting her clean at Vault 95's medical facility using the same equipment that once helped and then destroyed hundreds of recovering addicts. Destroying adults was one thing, but Vault-Tec's most evil experiments targeted the one group that couldn't fight back: children. Vault 75. Vault 75 told parents they were saving their children through education, actually executed every adult immediately after the door sealed, then raised the kids as test subjects for genetic harvesting. The experiment killed children at 18 after evaluating their genetics, either harvesting their DNA if they were superior or turning them into staff. The graduation ceremony was literally a firing squad, with the Vault's mainframe in Fallout 4 showing records of hundreds of children terminated after their final exams. The psychological evaluations show kids were encouraged to form friendships and relationships specifically so researchers could study how they handled losing them to graduation, with notes about optimal grief responses. But even child harvesting wasn't as mathematically evil as what they did with the breeding program in Los Angeles. Vault 63. Vault 63 started as a normal vault until post-war modifications turned it into a weather machine that could reverse ghoulification but created violent electromagnetic storms across Appalachia. The Stoltz family discovered the vault generations after the bombs and modified its systems to try saving their ghoulified daughter. accidentally creating lost creatures that are basically super aggressive ghouls with lightning powers. The original experiment involved atmospheric manipulation to create perfect growing conditions, but the nuclear war's radiation interacted with the weather systems to create something nobody predicted. In Fallout 76's Skyline Valley update, you learn the weather experiments caused massive storms that destroyed settlements and created an entire region of electrical anomalies where your power armor might randomly shut down. The Vault's overseer went mad trying to perfect the weather control system, leaving behind journals about how she started seeing the storms as divine punishment for humanity's sins. Hugo Stoltz, desperate to cure his daughter Cassidy, ignored every warning sign and turned the entire vault into a massive Tesla coil that shoots lightning at anything that moves. The modification process required human neural tissue to interface with the weather control matrix, meaning Hugo literally put pieces of his own brain into the machine to save his daughter. This vault proved that even good intentions and family love can create disasters when you're messing with forces beyond human understanding. All of these experiments failed because people died too quickly, so Vault-Tec tried something different, vaults that actually work. And that's when things got really twisted. Vault 21. Vault 21 solved every dispute through gambling, creating a functioning society where blackjack determined who got extra water rations and poker decided vault leadership. The experiment worked perfectly with residents living in relative peace, settling everything from marriage proposals to maintenance schedules through games of chance, until Mr. House showed up and won the entire vault in a rigged game. The society developed its own culture around luck, with children learning card games before they could read, and elderly residents treated as wise elders if they'd survived decades of high-stakes gambling for basic necessities. Half the residents wanted to stay isolated, while the other half wanted to open up to the wasteland. He then filled most of the vault with concrete, kicked out the residents, and turned the entrance into a hotel on the Vegas Strip, keeping just enough rooms intact for tourists to gawk at how people used to live. Sarah Weintraub still runs the gift shop in New Vegas. The vault's success rate was so high that House had to actively sabotage it because a functioning anarchist gambling society didn't fit his vision of New Vegas. This vault actually succeeded in creating a peaceful society, which is exactly why House had to destroy it, because functional communities are bad for business. But at least the gamblers had a chance at winning, unlike the doomed pacifists who never stood a chance. Vault 94. Vault 94 recruited religious pacifists and programmed their vault to automatically open after 1 year so they'd have to share their resources with whoever showed up. The residents were so committed to non-violence that when raiders arrived demanding supplies, they welcomed them with open arms and got slaughtered for their kindness. The vault's residents had spent their year creating a garden paradise with abundant food and pure water, even developing new cultivation techniques that could have saved the wasteland if they'd survived to share them. The experiment tested whether pure pacifism could survive in the wasteland if you thought testing pacifism against raiders was cruel. The diverse ideology experiment created 4 different flavors of wasteland violence. Vault 15. Vault 15 crammed together people from wildly different political, religious, and cultural backgrounds, then opened the door after just 50 years to see what kind of society they'd create. Instead of melting pot harmony, the vault exploded into 4 distinct groups: the Khans who became raiders, the Vipers who started a snake cult, the Jackals who went full cannibal, and the only reasonable people who founded Shady Sands. The experiment was testing if extreme diversity under pressure would create unity or chaos. And Vault-Tec got their answer when residents started forming gangs before the door even opened. The new California Republic, the most successful post-war nation, came from this vault's refugees, which is ironic since the experiment was designed to fail. The vault's education system broke down within a decade as different groups refused to let their children learn together, creating separate schools that taught completely different versions of history. This vault proved that forcing incompatible groups together doesn't create understanding, it creates 4 different flavors of wasteland violence. What happens when you give those same violent impulses unlimited firepower? Vault 34. Vault 34 gave its residents unlimited access to weapons, but didn't provide enough space or food, creating an overpopulated powder keg where everyone had guns, but nobody had room to breathe, creating a culture where violence was the first solution to any problem. When riots broke out over overpopulation, the survivors split into 2 groups, with one becoming the boomers who worship explosions at Nellis Air Force Base, while the others turned into ghouls trapped in the flooded vault. The reactor leak that ghoulified the remaining residents happened because someone used explosives to breach the armory door, causing a chain reaction that irradiated the entire lower level. The boomers who escaped developed an entire religion around explosives, believing that the bigger the boom, the closer to God, which explains why they shoot artillery at anyone approaching their base. This experiment asked what happens when you give everyone guns but nothing else, and the answer is they'll use those guns to take what they need. But this was nowhere near as sophisticated as the VIP RoboBrain murder mystery that played out for centuries. Vault 118. Vault 118 split ultra-wealthy residents who became RoboBrains from working-class people in terrible conditions, but the poor section was never finished, so only the rich folks' brains in jars survived to have the world's worst dinner party for 200 years. The experiment wanted to study class warfare, but ended up with a bunch of entitled brains in robot bodies murdering each other over petty pre-war drama while complaining about the service, turning the vault into a robot Agatha Christie novel where every butler did it. The RoboBrains still dress for dinner despite having no need to eat, hold board meetings despite having no corporation. The working class section is just empty concrete rooms and construction equipment, showing they never intended for poor people to survive at all. This vault proved that rich people's personalities are so toxic that even removing their bodies doesn't make them bearable. If you thought robot class warfare was absurd, the control vault that started everything proved even perfect. Isolation was just another experiment. Vault 13. Vault 13 was supposed to be a control vault studying long-term isolation for 200 years, but a broken water chip turned it into a desperate survival story that launched the entire Fallout franchise. The Vault Dweller got sent into the wasteland to find a replacement chip, discovering the super mutant threat and defeating the Master, only to be exiled for being too contaminated by the outside world to return. The Overseer's decision to exile the person who saved them all revealed that even successful vaults prioritized their experiment parameters over basic human gratitude or logic. The vault's records show they knew the water chip was failing for months, but kept it secret to prevent panic, inadvertently creating the conditions for their savior's emergence. This vault proved that Vault-Tec's control groups were just experiments waiting for something to go wrong. Even the control vaults were experiments, but at least those people had hope of survival. Some vaults were designed to kill everyone from day one. Vault 12. Vault 12's door was designed never to seal properly, exposing everyone inside to massive radiation that turned them into ghouls, while they thought they were safe from the bombs. The residents spent months wondering why people were getting sick, their hair falling out, their skin peeling off, before realizing the very shelter meant to save them was killing them slowly. Within a year, everyone was either dead or transformed into radiation-scarred ghouls, creating the settlement of Necropolis, where the ghouls tried to build a new society while dealing with discrimination from smooth-skinned humans. The Overseer knew about the door, but was ordered to tell nobody, dying of radiation poisoning while maintaining the lie that help was coming. This experiment was supposedly studying radiation's effects on humans, but really it was just creating a new subspecies of humanity through deliberate torture. If you thought radiation torture was bad, try spending 200 years completely alone with nothing but fabric dolls for company Vault 77. Vault 77 contained one man and a crate full of puppets, designed to study the effects of complete isolation with only inanimate objects for company, creating the legend of the puppet man who went completely insane. After years alone, the man started treating the puppets as real people, holding puppet trials, puppet executions, and even a puppet revolution, where he destroyed half of them in a rage before crying over their cloth corpses. He escaped after murdering the king puppet in what he described as a coup, entering the wasteland wearing a crown made from puppet heads and claiming to be the rightful ruler of the Puppet Kingdom. The jumpsuit from Vault 77 is found in Fallout 3's Paradise Falls, suggesting the Puppet Man became a slaver, though some say he still wanders the wastes performing shows for anyone who'll watch. This experiment proved that humans need actual human contact, not just faces to talk to, or they'll create their own reality where fabric and wood become more real than flesh and blood. But two vaults were so disturbing, even Fallout won't show you what happened inside Vault 68 and 69. Vault 68 contained 999 men and one woman, while Vault 69 had 999 women and one man, creating social dynamics so messed up that Bethesda refuses to show what actually happened inside. The experiments were supposedly studying how extreme gender imbalances affect society. Every vault I've shown you was designed to fail through horror, torture, or death. But the most terrifying vault of all was designed to succeed perfect because it proves Vault-Tec's ultimate plan worked. Vault 76. Vault 76 was a control vault with no experiment except gathering America's best and brightest, giving them 25 years to prepare, then releasing them to rebuild civilization on reclamation. The residents were carefully selected for their skills and psychological profile, creating a community of overachievers who spent decades training for the moment they'd emerge to reclaim Appalachia, essentially creating the most prepared post-apocalypse survivors possible. When the door opened in 2102, these vault dwellers spread across West Virginia Virginia to become the players in Fallout 76, each pursuing their own vision of rebuilding from launching nukes to opening shops. Within weeks of leaving, these perfect candidates for rebuilding were launching nukes at each other for better loot, proving that human nature beats training every time. Unlike every other vault where residents died horribly, Vault 76's people successfully established settlements. This vault proved that even when Vault-Tec played it straight, the world after the bombs didn't care about their pre-war plan. From the white noise soldiers of Vault 92 to the cloning disasters of Vault 108, from the voting murders of Vault 11 to the executive breeding programs of the Tri-Vault conspiracy, each one revealing that Vault-Tec saw the apocalypse not as humanity's end, but as their chance to play God with the survivors. Vault 1. The Los Angeles Vault was one of Vault-Tec's early prototypes, built beneath the Los Angeles Cathedral. This vault might have been intended as a control vault, or just an early test run. But honestly, it doesn't matter what Vault-Tec planned because something way worse took over. The Master, that grotesque blob of flesh and malice from the first Fallout game, discovered this vault and turned it into his base of operations. He used the residents as test subjects for FEV transformation, basically turning them into super mutants against their will. The Vault Dweller eventually put an end to this nightmare by detonating a nuclear bomb inside the vault in 2162, killing the Master and proving that sometimes the only way to stop evil is with more explosives. But if you thought the Master's takeover was bad, Vault 3 shows what happens when good intentions meet pure evil in the wasteland. Vault 3. Located in the Mojave Wasteland, Vault 3 was actually one of the 17 legitimate control vaults, designed to genuinely protect its inhabitants without any twisted experiments. For over 2 centuries, it worked exactly as advertised, keeping its residents safe from the nuclear wasteland outside. The problem came in the 23rd century when a severe water leak forced the vault dwellers to open their doors to the outside world. These people had lived in safety for generations, completely naive about the brutal realities of post-war America. When the Fiend's Raider gang discovered the open vault, they didn't see potential allies or trading partners. They saw easy targets. The Raiders systematically slaughtered the innocent Vault Dwellers and took over Vault 3 as their base, turning one of humanity's few success stories into a drug-fueled nightmare den. The irony is devastating. Vault 3 proved that Vault-Tec's technology could actually work when they weren't deliberately sabotaging it, but the post-war world was so hostile that even a functioning vault couldn't protect its residents from human cruelty. Speaking of vaults that actually worked as intended, Vault 8 became one of the Wasteland's greatest success stories. Vault 8? Vault 8 was another control vault, equipped with a Garden of Eden creation kit and designed to open after just 10 years in 2087. But here's where things get interesting. Due to a shipping error that sounds almost too convenient to be accidental, Vault 8 received all the water chips that were meant for Vault 13. This meant they had backup water supplies, while Vault 13 would later face the water crisis that kicks off the entire first Fallout game. The residents of Vault 8 actually emerged early in 2079 and used their GECK to establish Vault City, which became one of the most technologically advanced and prosperous settlements in the post-war world. They created a functioning society with clean technology, medical advances, and actual governance. Vault City proves that when Vault-Tec wasn't actively trying to torture people, their technology could genuinely rebuild civilization. The success of Vault 8 makes the failure of other vaults even more tragic because it shows what could have been accomplished if the corporation had actually cared about humanity's survival instead of conducting sick experiments. But while Vault 8 residents were building a utopia, the people in Vault 11 were trapped in a democratic nightmare that would make Orwell weep. Vault 11. The Mojave Wasteland's Vault 11 housed what might be the most psychologically devastating experiment in the entire Fallout universe. Residents were told they had to democratically elect one person each year to be sacrificed, or everyone would die. This wasn't just murder. It was systematic psychological torture disguised as civic duty. Over the decades, this annual death sentence corrupted the entire society. Political factions formed specifically to manipulate the Overseer election, using it as a weapon to eliminate rivals. The Vault became a cesspool of corruption, blackmail, and political manipulation where democracy itself became a tool of murder. Families turned against each other, friends betrayed friends, and the very concept of voting became associated with condemning someone to death. After generations of this horror, only 5 residents remained. These final survivors finally said no. They refused to elect anyone for sacrifice, choosing to face whatever consequences awaited. The Vault's computer system congratulated them for finally breaking the cycle, revealing that this was the intended outcome all along. but the psychological damage was complete. 4 of the 5 survivors immediately committed suicide from the crushing guilt of participating in decades of ritualized murder. Vault 11 proves that Vault-Tec understood how to weaponize democracy itself, turning humanity's greatest political achievement into a tool for systematic psychological destruction. If Vault 11 shows how Vault-Tec corrupted democracy, Vault 12 demonstrates their willingness to deliberately expose people to radiation just to see what would happen. Vault 12. Built in Bakersfield, Vault 12 featured a deliberately faulty vault door that wouldn't seal properly, ensuring constant radiation exposure for its residents. This wasn't an accident or equipment failure. Vault-Tec specifically designed this vault to study the effects of radiation on human populations, basically using an entire community as lab rats. The radiation exposure transformed the residents into ghouls, those distinctive post-war humans with rotting skin but extended lifespans. Rather than dying from the radiation, they adapted in the most horrific way possible, becoming living testaments to human resilience and Vault-Tec's cruelty. These ghoul residents eventually founded the city of Necropolis above ground, creating one of the first major settlements in the post-war world. Ironically, Vault 12 became crucial to saving other Vault dwellers. The Vault dweller from Vault 13 discovered a replacement water chip here, making Necropolis essential to the first game's main quest. The ghouls of Necropolis prove that even Vault-Tec's most callous experiments couldn't completely destroy human dignity and community. The connection to Vault 13 isn't coincidental, because that vault was designed for an experiment almost as cruel as deliberate radiation exposure. Vault 13. Every Fallout fan knows Vault 13 as the player's home vault in the first game, but its true purpose was testing prolonged isolation. This vault was designed to remain sealed for 200 years, studying how complete isolation from the outside world would affect human psychology and social development. The residents had no idea they were test subjects in a psychological experiment spanning multiple generations. The water chip malfunction that forces the Vault dweller to leave wasn't part of the original experiment, but it created the perfect opportunity to study what happens when someone from a completely isolated society encounters the post-war world for the first time. The Vault dweller's journey across the wasteland was essentially Vault-Tec's experiment continuing in the wild. Later, the Enclave invaded Vault 13 and killed most of the remaining residents for FEV experiments, proving that even the government Vault-Tec worked with saw Vault dwellers as expendable test subjects. The New California Republic eventually took control of the Vault, but by then, the original community was essentially extinct. Vault 13's story spans the entire series, showing how Vault-Tec's experiments had consequences that lasted for generations. While Vault 13 tested isolation, Vault 15 experimented with the opposite problem by cramming together people who fundamentally disagreed about everything. Vault 15. Vault-Tec deliberately populated Vault 15 with people holding radically different political ideologies and cultural backgrounds, then watched to see how they'd interact in confined spaces. This wasn't about studying cooperation or conflict resolution. This was about deliberately creating social tension to observe how different groups would fragment under pressure. Predictably, the residents eventually split into factions based on their conflicting beliefs. But here's what makes this experiment particularly significant. Those factions didn't just argue themselves to death. Some residents left to found Shady Sands, which eventually became the New California Republic, one of the most important political entities in the Fallout universe. Other groups became raider gangs like the Khans, showing how the same vault could produce both civilization builders and wasteland destroyers. Vault 15 basically demonstrates that Vault-Tec accidentally created a microcosm of post-war America, where ideological differences would shape the entire political landscape for centuries. The NCR's democratic values and the Khans' anarchistic raiding culture both trace back to people who lived in the same underground bunker, proving that environment matters less than ideology when rebuilding civilization. But if forcing different groups together created political chaos, Vault 19 shows what happens when you make those same groups paranoid about each other. Vault 19. The Mojave Wastelands Vault 19 featured a unique design with 2 overseers governing separate red and blue sectors within the same vault. But this wasn't about redundancy or administrative efficiency. This was about inducing paranoia through psychological manipulation, using subliminal messaging, fake medical records, strange noises, and flickering lights to make each sector suspect the other of sabotage. The experiment worked exactly as designed. Both factions developed severe paranoia about their neighbors, constantly suspecting sabotage and conspiracy. Residents lived in constant fear and suspicion, never able to trust the people living just down the hallway. The psychological stress was so intense that the vault was eventually abandoned, possibly due to sulfur gas from nearby caves, but more likely because the paranoia became completely unbearable. Vault 19 proves that Vault-Tec understood how to weaponize architecture itself, using physical design and environmental manipulation to create mental illness. The Two Overseer system shows how authority figures can be used to legitimize completely irrational fears, turning leadership into a tool for psychological torture. After all that paranoia and conflict, Vault 21 seems almost refreshingly wholesome in its approach to human nature. Vault 21. Built under pre-war Las Vegas, Vault 21 created a society where every dispute and decision was settled through gambling. This wasn't about studying addiction or financial irresponsibility. This was about creating what Vault-Tec called perfect equilibrium, by making chance the ultimate arbiter of all social interactions. For over 200 years, this system actually worked. Residents lived in harmony because no one could blame anyone else for the outcomes of pure chance. Conflicts were resolved through card games, dice rolls, and other games of chance, creating a society where luck determined everything from daily chores to major policy decisions. It was probably the most peaceful Vault experiment in the entire series. The experiment only ended when Mr. House, who understood the power of gambling better than anyone, won control of the Vault through its own systems. He filled most of the Vault with concrete and converted the top level into a hotel and casino, essentially absorbing Vault 21 into his New Vegas empire. In a way, this was the perfect ending for a Vault based on gambling, because House played the ultimate game and won everything. Vault 21 shows that not all of Vault-Tec's experiments were designed to cause suffering. Some were genuinely trying to find new ways to organize human society, even if the methods were completely bizarre. But while Vault 21's residents were peacefully gambling their way through the apocalypse, the scientists in Vault 22 were creating a biological nightmare that would contaminate an entire region. Vault 22. Populated by scientists researching plant growth and pest control, Vault 22 initially seemed like one of the more beneficial experiments. The Vault was equipped for agricultural research, and the scientists were working on legitimate projects to improve food production and pest management. This actually sounded like something that could help rebuild the world. The experiment went catastrophically wrong when the scientists began working with Beauveria mordicana fungus for pest control. The airborne spores didn't just kill pests, they infected the human residents, turning them into cannibalistic spore carriers who retained just enough intelligence to hunt and kill, but lost everything that made them human. The Vault became a fungal nightmare where former scientists shambled through the halls as infected monsters. Some survivors managed to flee to Zion Canyon, but the fungal infection followed them. These refugees eventually died, but not before spreading the contamination that would affect the entire region. Vault 22 proves that even well-intentioned scientific research becomes horrific when conducted in Vault-Tec facilities, because the corporation never implemented proper safety protocols. They were more interested in observing what happened than preventing disasters. The biological contamination from Vault 22 shows how Vault-Tec's experiments didn't just affect Vault residents. They created lasting environmental damage that would plague the wasteland for centuries. Speaking of environmental damage, Vault 27 was designed to create a completely different kind of disaster through simple overcrowding. Vault 27. This vault was deliberately designed to house 2 people in space meant for 1 0, testing the effects of extreme overpopulation on human psychology and social structures. Vault-Tec wanted to see how people would react when they literally couldn't escape from each other, when privacy became impossible, and when basic resources had to be shared among twice as many people as the space could reasonably support. Unfortunately, Vault 27 is only mentioned in the Fallout Bible and never appeared in any actual games, so we don't know exactly what happened inside. But honestly, you don't need much imagination to picture the results. Extreme overcrowding would create competition for basic necessities, eliminate personal space, and probably lead to violence, disease, and psychological breakdown. The fact that this vault was planned shows how thoroughly Vault-Tec understood human nature's darker aspects. Vault 27 represents one of the most straightforward experiments in the entire program, because it didn't require complex technology or elaborate psychological manipulation. It just required cramming too many people into too small a space and watching them destroy each other. But while Vault 27 tested overcrowding, the interconnected Vault system featured in the Fallout TV series shows how Vault-Tec could coordinate multiple experiments simultaneously. Vault 31, 32, and 33. The Fallout television series introduced a connected Vault system that reveals new depths to Vault-Tec's planning and cruelty. Vault 31 housed Vault-Tec management and cryogenic storage, essentially preserving the corporation's leadership while the rest of humanity suffered through their experiments. Meanwhile, Vaults 32 and 33 served as breeding and population control experiments, designed to create manageable human communities under corporate oversight. This system shows that Vault-Tec wasn't just conducting random experiments. They were creating a comprehensive plan for post-war society, with themselves as the permanent ruling class. Vault 31's management could wake up periodically to check on their experiments, then return to cryogenic sleep while generations of test subjects lived and died under their control. Vault 32 suffered a catastrophic failure that wiped out its population, while Vault 33 serves as the main setting for the TV series, where protagonist Lucy eventually emerges to discover the truth about the surface world. The interconnected design proves that Vault-Tec was thinking beyond individual experiments toward a complete system of human control spanning multiple facilities. This connected approach makes the corporation's crimes even more systematic and deliberate, showing they weren't just conducting isolated experiments but creating an entire infrastructure for post-war domination. But while the TV series Vaults represent corporate control, Vault 34 shows what happens when you give people too much access to weapons and too little space to use them safely. Vault 34. Deliberately overstocked with weapons and ammunition while providing limited living space, Vault 34 was designed to test how a heavily armed population would react to overcrowding. Vault-Tec basically created a powder keg by combining two elements guaranteed to create violence: too many people and too many guns. The experiment worked exactly as you'd expect. Overcrowding led to tensions, tensions led to violence, and the abundance of weapons made that violence deadly. When the Overseer tried to lock down the armory to prevent further bloodshed, a faction calling themselves the Boomers decided they'd had enough and left the vault entirely. These Boomers eventually settled at Nellis Air Force Base, where they became the explosives-obsessed faction you can encounter in Fallout New Vegas. The fighting over weapons access damaged the vault's reactor, irradiating the remaining residents and turning them into ghouls. So, Vault 34 managed to create both external and internal disasters. It released a heavily armed faction into the wasteland while simultaneously poisoning everyone who stayed behind. The Vault perfectly demonstrates how Vault-Tec's experiments often created problems that extended far beyond the original test subjects. The Boomers' obsession with explosives and their distrust of outsiders directly trace back to their traumatic experience in Vault 34, proving that the psychological damage from these experiments shaped entire cultures in the post-war world. While Vault 34 tested human reactions to weapons access, Vault 51 let an artificial intelligence decide who deserved to live and who deserved to die. Vault 51. Located in Appalachia and managed by a Zax supercomputer, Vault 51 represents one of Vault-Tec's most technologically advanced experiments in social engineering. The computer was programmed to run combat trials among the residents to select the perfect overseer through a process of elimination that basically turned Vault management into a battle royale. Zax manipulated the residents into fighting each other using psychological pressure, resource scarcity, and direct commands, treating human beings like chess pieces in a deadly game. The computer had no understanding of human value or dignity. It only understood optimization and efficiency. Every resident who died was just data to help Zax refine its selection process for the ideal leader. All the original residents died during these trials, proving that the computer's idea of perfect leadership selection was fundamentally flawed. Later, the vault was inhabited by wastelanders who also died or became scorched, showing that ZAX's experiments continued even after the original population was eliminated. Vault 51 demonstrates how Vault-Tec was willing to hand over complete control of human lives to artificial intelligence with no moral constraints. This vault basically previews what would happen if technology completely replaced human judgment in matters of life and death, creating a sterile, efficient process for eliminating unfit individuals that sounds disturbingly familiar to anyone who knows 20th century history. But if artificial intelligence management was frightening, the human-controlled experiments in Vault 63 prove that flesh and blood scientists can be even more monstrous than machines. Vault 63, also known as the Cadaver Project Vault, Vault 63 conducted illegal human cloning and ghoulification experiments under the direction of Hugo Stolz, a scientist who makes Dr. Frankenstein look like a humanitarian. These weren't medical experiments aimed at helping people. These were deliberate attempts to create artificial humans and to perfect the process of turning people into ghouls. Stolz created the Lost, which were modified ghouls with electrical sight capabilities, basically turning human beings into living weapons with enhanced sensory abilities. The cloning experiments involved harvesting DNA from staff members to create artificial humans, treating human reproduction like an industrial process. The ghoulification research aimed to perfect the radiation exposure process that created ghouls, giving Vault-Tec the ability to deliberately transform people. The Vault became extremely dangerous as Stolz's experiments got completely out of control. Most inhabitants were either transformed into monstrous creatures or killed outright. The few survivors had to live in constant fear of the modified ghouls and failed experiments that roamed the facility. Vault 63 shows how individual scientists within the Vault-Tec system could become even more cruel and experimental than the corporate-mandated experiments. Hugo Stolz represents the kind of person who thrived in Vault-Tec's system. Someone who saw human beings as raw materials for experimentation rather than people deserving basic dignity and respect. Speaking of experiments that treated humans as disposable resources, Vaults 68 and 69 represent some of the most obviously doomed social experiments in the entire program. Vault 68 and 69. These gender imbalance experiments are mentioned in the Fallout Bible but never actually shown in the games, which is probably for the best given how obviously horrific they would be. Vault 68 housed 999 men and 1 woman, while Vault 69 housed 999 women and 1 man. Vault-Tec apparently wanted to study extreme gender imbalances and their effects on social stability and reproduction. You don't need a degree in sociology to predict these outcomes. The single woman in Vault 68 would face impossible pressure, harassment, and probably violence from men competing for her attention. The genetic bottleneck would create severe birth defects and population collapse within a few generations. Similarly, the single man in Vault 69 would be under enormous pressure to reproduce while dealing with complex social dynamics among 999 women. Both vaults would theoretically result in violence, social breakdown, and genetic disasters that would doom their populations. The experiments show how Vault-Tec was willing to condemn entire communities to slow extinction just to gather data about human reproductive behavior under extreme conditions. These vaults represent social engineering at its most callous and short-sighted. The fact that these experiments were planned but never shown in games suggests that even the Fallout developers recognized they were too disturbing to portray, which honestly says a lot given some of the other content in the series. But while Vault 68 and 69 focused on reproductive pressure, Vault 70 was designed to test how religious communities would handle equipment failure. Vault 70. Populated by Mormon groups in the Salt Lake City area, Vault 70 was equipped with jumpsuit manufacturing equipment programmed to fail after just 6 months. The residents were supposed to open the vault in 2190 and use their GECK to establish New Jerusalem, but they'd have to do it while dealing with clothing shortages and equipment failures. This experiment targeted a specific religious community known for self-reliance, community cooperation, and strong social structures. Vault-Tec wanted to see how these cultural values would hold up when faced with basic equipment failures and resource shortages. The jumpsuit manufacturing failure was designed to create practical problems that would test the community's problem-solving abilities and social cohesion. Vault 70 only appears in the Fallout Bible and was never implemented in any games, so we don't know how the experiment would have played out. But the targeting of a specific religious group shows how Vault-Tec's experiments often focused on particular cultural communities, using their distinct values and social structures as variables in psychological research. The fact that this vault was designed around religious identity shows how thoroughly Vault-Tec understood and exploited American cultural diversity for experimental purposes. But if targeting religious communities seems callous, Vault 75 reveals the true depths of Vault-Tec's willingness to destroy families and children for the sake of eugenics research. Vault 75. Built under Malden Middle School and advertised as a child-friendly shelter, Vault 75 was actually a eugenics program designed to execute parents and transform children into perfect specimens for genetic harvesting. Families entered thinking they were saving their children from nuclear war. Instead, they were delivering their kids directly to Vault-Tec's most monstrous experiment. Upon entry, all parents were immediately murdered while their children were told they had died from radiation exposure. The children then underwent brutal training and testing designed to identify the most physically and mentally superior specimens. This wasn't education or child development. This was systematic conditioning to create human beings optimized for specific traits. The truly horrifying part is what happened to the successful children. Rather than being rewarded for their excellence, they were killed so their genetic material could be harvested for future experiments. The children who failed the testing were kept alive to serve the facility, basically becoming slave labor for their own prison. Eventually, the surviving children rebelled and killed their captors, but not before generations had been murdered. Vault 75 was later overrun by gunners, but the damage was already done. This vault represents the absolute nadir of Vault-Tec's crimes, because it specifically targeted families and children with deliberate deception, then systematically murdered parents and tortured children in the name of genetic optimization. The The fact that this vault was built under a school shows how completely Vault-Tec was willing to pervert symbols of childhood and education for the most evil purposes imaginable. After learning about Vault 75's crimes against children, Vault 76 almost seems too normal to believe. Vault 76. One of the 17 control vaults, Vault 76 was designed to celebrate America's tricentennial while testing the effects of isolation on competitive personalities. This vault actually functioned as advertised, keeping its residents safe for exactly 25 years before opening as scheduled in 2102. The residents then emerged to reclaim Appalachia after the Scorched Plague had ended. Vault 76 serves as the player's starting point in Fallout 76, and it's refreshing to finally encounter a vault that didn't involve torture, murder, or psychological manipulation. The experiment focused on studying competitive people under isolation, but this was genuine research rather than deliberate cruelty. The residents were actually volunteers who knew they'd be opening the vault and rebuilding America. The vault's success makes all the other experiments even more tragic, because it proves that Vault-Tec could have built 122 legitimate shelters if they had actually cared about humanity's survival. Instead, they built 121 laboratories of horror and 17 actual shelters, condemning thousands of people to death and suffering for research that ultimately served the Enclave's goal of abandoning Earth entirely. Vault 76 represents what the Vault program could have been if it had actually been designed to preserve and rebuild human civilization rather than exploiting it for data. But while Vault 76 residents were rebuilding America, the people in Vault 79 were sitting on enough wealth to fund entire nations. Vault 79. Secretly containing the United States gold reserves transferred from Fort Knox, Vault 79 wasn't really about protecting people. It was about protecting America's wealth for whoever would control the post-war government. This vault basically served as an underground Fort Knox, ensuring that the nation's gold would survive nuclear war even if the nation itself didn't. The gold reserves created constant power struggles among the vault residents, because everyone understood they were sitting on unimaginable wealth while the outside world struggled with bottle caps as currency. The presence of so much valuable material turned the vault into a pressure cooker of greed and political maneuvering, with different factions fighting for control of resources that could reshape the entire wasteland economy. In Fallout 76, players eventually gain access to Vault 79 and must decide how to distribute the gold reserves among various factions, essentially determining the economic future of Appalachia. The Vault shows how Vault-Tec was planning for post-war economic control as much as social control, ensuring that whoever inherited their legacy would have the financial resources to dominate rebuilt civilization. Vault 79 proves that Vault-Tec wasn't just conducting experiments for scientific knowledge. They were positioning themselves to control every aspect of post-war society, from social structures to economic systems. But while Vault 79 hoarded wealth, Vault 81 was supposed to be conducting medical research that could actually help people. Vault 81. Designed as a disease research facility with a hidden experimental section, Vault 81 was supposed to expose residents to diseases and radiation to study mutations and develop cures. This actually sounds like legitimate medical research that could benefit humanity. But of course, Vault-Tec found a way to make it horrific by using unwitting test subjects instead of informed volunteers. The experiment failed because Chief Scientist Kenneth Collins refused to follow orders and sealed off the disease research area rather than exposing innocent people to pathogens. The main vault then functioned normally for over 200 years, becoming one of the few vault communities to actually thrive without outside interference. The secret research area was overrun by infected mole rats, but the residents remained safe. In Fallout 4, the player can help cure a child named Austin who becomes infected, showing how the vault's medical expertise was ultimately used to save lives rather than take them. The vault's doctor, Olivet, represents what Vault-Tec scientists could have accomplished if they had been allowed to follow ethical medical practices instead of corporate mandates for human experimentation. Vault 81 demonstrates that individual conscience could sometimes overcome institutional evil, because one scientist's refusal to conduct unethical experiments saved an entire community from decades of medical torture. But while Vault 81's scientists prevented disease experiments, the researchers in Vault 87 enthusiastically embraced biological warfare research with results that would terrorize the wasteland for centuries. Vault 87. Created through a partnership between Vault-Tec and the US military, Vault 87 was designed to test the forced evolutionary virus on human subjects to create super soldiers. This wasn't a civilian experiment that got out of hand. This was deliberate collaboration between corporate and military interests to develop biological weapons using unwilling human test subjects. The The FEV experiments created numerous supermutants through forced viral infection, turning normal people into massive, often sterile creatures with enhanced strength but diminished intelligence. The transformation process was agonizing and irreversible, essentially murdering the person while keeping their body alive as a weapon. Most supermutants retained enough memory to know they had been human, making their existence a form of living hell. Eventually, the supermutants overpowered their creators, killed the scientists, and took over the Vault completely. They turned Vault 87 into a supermutant factory, kidnapping wastelanders and forcing them through FEV transformation to create more of their kind. The Vault became a source of ongoing terror for the capital Wasteland, because the supermutants had to constantly capture new victims to maintain their population. Vault 87 shows how Vault-Tec's experiments didn't just harm their original test subjects. They created ongoing threats that would plague the wasteland for generations. As supermutants continued the cycle of kidnapping and transformation that their creators had started. The Vault also reveals how eagerly the US military collaborated with Vault-Tec's human experimentation, proving that the corporation's crimes had full government backing and support. Speaking of government collaboration, Vault 88 gave Vault-Tec the opportunity to test prototype technologies before rolling them out to other facilities. Vault 88. Located at Quincy Quarries, Vault 88 served as a testing facility for prototype devices and technologies that would later be distributed to other vaults. This was basically Vault-Tec's research and development laboratory, where they could experiment with new forms of psychological manipulation and social control before implementing them on a larger scale. Construction was never completed when the bombs fell, leaving Vault 88 as an unfinished facility filled with experimental equipment. In Fallout 4's Vault-Tec Workshop DLC, the player can actually complete the vault and conduct experiments on settlers, essentially becoming a Vault-Tec overseer and experiencing the experiment design process firsthand. The DLC allows players to build devices that can manipulate settler happiness, health, and behavior through various forms of psychological conditioning. You can create exercise bikes that drug riders, slot machines that condition gambling behavior, and other devices that would fit perfectly into Vault-Tec's catalog of human manipulation tools. Vault 88 is unique because it lets players experience the moral choices that Vault-Tec scientists faced every day. You can choose to use the experimental equipment ethically to actually help your settlers, or you can embrace the corporation's legacy and conduct psychological experiments on unwilling subjects. The DLC basically asks whether you'd become complicit in Vault-Tec's crimes if given the opportunity. But while Vault 88 let scientists test new torture devices, Vault 92 used one of humanity's most beautiful achievements as a weapon against the human mind. Vault 92. Populated by talented musicians supposedly selected for artistic preservation, Vault 92 used subliminal white noise messages hidden in musical performances to create mind-controlled super soldiers. The Vault perverted music itself, turning artistic expression into a tool for psychological warfare and mental manipulation. The white noise programming was designed to override conscious thought and replace it with military conditioning, essentially turning artists into programmed killers. But the human mind isn't a computer, and the subliminal messages had catastrophic unintended effects. Instead of creating obedient soldiers, the white noise drove residents violently insane, causing them to attack each other in fits of uncontrollable rage. Professor Malleus discovered the truth about the experiment and tried to warn people, but he was likely killed for attempting to expose the program. The Vault descended into chaos as musicians tore each other apart, their minds shattered by the very art they had devoted their lives to creating. The facility eventually flooded and was abandoned, leaving behind recordings that still contain traces of the mind-altering frequencies. Vault 92 represents one of Vault-Tec's most cynical experiments, because it specifically targeted people with artistic talent and sensitivity, then used their greatest passion as a weapon against them. The Vault shows how completely the corporation was willing to corrupt human culture and creativity for military purposes. But while Vault 92 corrupted artistic expression, Vault 94 shows what happens when people with genuinely good intentions try to use Vault-Tec technology. Vault 94. Populated by a pacifist community and equipped with a Garden of Eden creation kit, Vault 94 was actually designed to test whether peaceful people could successfully use GECK technology for environmental restoration. This experiment started with genuinely good intentions and actually succeeded for years, with the pacifist residents creating thriving agricultural systems and environmental restoration projects. The disaster came from outside when a delegation visiting the Vault accidentally detonated the GECK with a minigun. This wasn't sabotage or deliberate destruction. It was a tragic accident that shows how dangerous Vault-Tec's technology could be even when used by well-meaning people. The GECK explosion caused massive radiation exposure and triggered a strangler vine outbreak that created the entire Meyer region. Vault 94 proves that even when Vault-Tec technology worked as intended and was operated by people with the best possible intentions, it could still create environmental disasters that would last for centuries. The pacifist community's success at agriculture and environmental restoration makes their accidental destruction even more tragic, because they represented one of the few genuinely positive uses of Vault technology. The creation of the Meyer shows how Vault-Tec's technology was inherently unstable and dangerous, capable of causing massive environmental damage even when operated by experts with peaceful intentions. Speaking of people with good intentions facing technological disasters, Vault 95 shows how Vault-Tec could corrupt even successful recovery programs. Vault 95. Designed as a rehabilitation center for chem addicts, Vault 95 actually succeeded in its stated purpose for 5 years. Residents overcame their addictions, built a supportive community, and created a functioning society based on mutual aid and recovery principles. This was one of the few Vault-Tec experiments that actually helped people instead of harming them. But the success was all part of a larger, more cruel experiment. After 5 years of sobriety, a Vault-Tec plant revealed a hidden drug stash that had been concealed in the vault all along. This deliberate reintroduction of drugs after years of recovery was designed to test whether rehabilitation could withstand temptation. But it was really just psychological torture disguised as research. The mass relapse that followed was swift and devastating. Residents who had fought for years to overcome their addictions were suddenly faced with unlimited access to the substances that had nearly destroyed their lives. Violence erupted as people fought over drugs, overdoses killed community members, and the supportive society collapsed into chaos. Everyone died, and the vault was later overrun by gunners. Vault 95 represents one of Vault-Tec's most psychologically cruel experiments because it gave people hope and community before deliberately destroying both. The corporation proved they understood exactly how to maximize psychological damage by first allowing success and then engineering failure. But while Vault 95 corrupted human recovery efforts, Vault 96 focused on preserving animal life for future environmental restoration. Vault 96. Designed as a cryogenic storage facility for animal preservation, Vault 96 actually served a legitimate purpose by storing animal embryos and specimens for ecosystem restoration after nuclear war. This vault represents one of the few Vault-Tec projects that could have genuinely helped rebuild the world by preserving biodiversity for future generations. The cryogenic storage system successfully preserved various creatures in suspended animation, maintaining genetic diversity that would be crucial for environmental restoration. Unlike most Vault experiments, this technology actually worked as advertised and served a beneficial purpose that extended beyond gathering data for Vault-Tec's other projects. However, some of the stored specimens later escaped or were deliberately released, populating Appalachia with dangerous creatures like deathclaws. This shows how even beneficial Vault-Tec projects could create unintended consequences when the stored animals were released into environments where they had no natural predators or ecological balance. Vault 96 proves that Vault-Tec possessed the technology and knowledge to genuinely help restore the post-war world, which makes their decision to focus on human experimentation even more morally inexcusable. They could have built 122 vaults dedicated to preserving human knowledge, culture, and biodiversity, but instead chose to conduct psychological torture experiments. But while Vault 96 preserved life for the future, Vault 101 was designed to trap people in the past forever. Vault 101. Every Fallout 3 player knows Vault 101 as their character's home, but the vault's true purpose was testing the role of an overseer when the vault was never supposed to open. This experiment studied permanent isolation effects by telling residents they could never leave, creating a society that would exist in perpetual underground confinement spanning multiple generations. Despite the mandate to never open, Vault 101 was actually breached multiple times throughout its history. James and the future lone wanderer arrived from outside, proving that the vault's isolation was never absolute. When the player character finally leaves to search for their father, it triggers internal conflict about whether the vault should open to the wasteland or maintain its isolation. The experiment basically studied what happens to human psychology when people believe they have no choice and no future beyond their current circumstances. The vault's society became authoritarian and rigid, with the overseer maintaining control through the promise of security and the threat of exile. Any questioning of authority was treated as a threat to everyone's survival. Vault 101's story shows how isolation can be used as a form of social control. because people will accept almost any authority if they believe it's necessary for their survival. The Vault demonstrates how Vault-Tec could use fear of the outside world to create completely compliant populations who would never question their leadership. But if permanent isolation created compliant populations, Vault 106 shows what happens when you destroy people's ability to distinguish reality from hallucination. Vault 106. Starting just 10 days after sealing, Vault 106 pumped hallucinogenic drugs through its air filtration system, exposing residents to constant psychoactive substances that would gradually destroy their sanity. This wasn't medical research or recreational drug use. This was deliberate chemical warfare against the Vault's own population. The constant drug exposure drove residents violently insane, creating a population of psychotic survivors who attack anyone who enters their territory. The Vault became a nightmare landscape where reality and hallucination blended together, making it impossible for residents to distinguish between actual threats and drug-induced paranoia. Players who visit Vault 106 experience these same hallucinations, getting a taste of what life was like for the original residents. The experiment continued for over 200 years, meaning multiple generations lived and died under constant chemical influence. Children born in the Vault never experienced normal consciousness, growing up in a world where hallucinations were normal and reality was uncertain. The psychological damage was so complete that the surviving residents became essentially feral, retaining just enough intelligence to be dangerous but losing everything that made them human. Vault 106 shows how Vault-Tec could use environmental manipulation to destroy human consciousness itself, proving that they were willing to sacrifice sanity, identity, and basic humanity for research data. But while Vault 106 destroyed individual identity through drugs, Vault 108 eliminated individuality through mass cloning. Vault 108. Designed as a human cloning experiment, Vault 108 repeatedly cloned a human subject named Gary while engineering power system failures to create environmental stress. The experiment was supposed to study whether cloned humans could maintain stable personalities and social structures, but it quickly devolved into something far more horrific. The Vault created 54 Gary clones, with each successive generation becoming more aggressive and unstable than the last. The clones retained the original Gary's memories and basic personality, but the cloning process introduced psychological deterioration that compounded with each iteration. The early clones might have seemed relatively normal, but the later ones were violent and barely functional. Eventually, the Gary clones broke containment and killed all the staff and original residents, leaving only hostile clones who attack anyone who enters their territory. The clones can only say Gary, having lost most language abilities while retaining enough intelligence to coordinate attacks and use weapons. Vault 108 became a nightmare of mass-produced violence where dozens of identical killers roam the halls. The Vault shows how Vault-Tec's cloning technology could create armies of identical soldiers, but it also demonstrates the psychological instability that would make such armies unreliable and dangerous even to their creators. The experiment basically created a preview of what mass human cloning would look like if implemented without proper safeguards or ethical constraints. But while Vault 108 created multiple copies of the same person, Vault 111 focused on preserving single individuals across impossible spans of time. Vault 111. Every Fallout 4 player starts their journey in Vault 111, but most don't realize they were unwitting test subjects in a cryogenic freezing experiment. Residents were told they were entering a normal vault for protection, but they were actually being tested for long-term effects of cryogenic preservation on human physiology and psychology. The experiment was supposed to last indefinitely, with residents remaining frozen while Vault-Tec studied the effects of extremely long-term suspended animation. But staff conflict erupted just 180 days after sealing, killing, or driving away all personnel and leaving the residents frozen without oversight for 210 years. The Institute later used the Vault for their own experiments, treating the frozen residents as a convenient source of genetic material. When the player character finally awakens, they represent the only successful long-term cryogenic preservation subject in the entire experiment. Their survival proves that the technology worked. But their psychological adjustment to the post-war world shows the mental trauma of losing everything and everyone they knew. The player character's quest to find their kidnapped son becomes a study in how someone would cope with complete temporal displacement. Vault 111 demonstrates that even Vault-Tec's more technologically impressive experiments were conducted without informed consent and abandoned when they became inconvenient for the corporation. The Vault shows how human beings were treated as disposable test subjects, even in experiments that could have genuinely benefited humanity. Speaking of experiments that could have benefited humanity, Vault 112 took the promise of virtual reality and turned it into a tool for psychological torture. Vault 112. Under the control of Dr. Stanislaus Braun, Vault 112 trapped residents in virtual reality simulations where they could be tortured, killed, and resurrected indefinitely for the amusement of a sadistic scientist. The Tranquility Lane simulation appeared to be a peaceful 1950s suburban neighborhood, but it was actually a prison where Braun could play God with human consciousness. For over 200 years, Braun repeatedly tortured the residents for entertainment, wiping their memories between sessions and killing them virtually before bringing them back to life. The residents experienced real pain and genuine psychological trauma, but they could never escape or even remember their previous suffering. It was psychological torture designed to be infinitely renewable. The simulation allowed Braun to experiment with human psychology without physical limitations, testing how people would react to impossible situations, moral dilemmas, and direct mental manipulation. He could force residents to commit acts they would never consider in real life, then study their psychological responses to trauma and guilt. The virtual environment made every form of psychological experiment possible without destroying the test subjects. Vault 112 represents the ultimate expression of Vault-Tec's goals: complete control over human consciousness with the ability to conduct unlimited experiments without consequences for the researchers. The Vault shows what would happen if science completely abandoned ethical constraints and treated human beings as nothing more than data sources. But while Vault 112 trapped people in virtual nightmares, Vault 114 was designed to create real world-class conflict through deliberate social engineering. Vault 114. Built beneath Park Street Station to house wealthy Boston elite in deliberately poor conditions under incompetent, paranoid leadership, Vault 114 was designed to test how entitled wealthy people would react to poverty and bad governance. The experiment would have forced rich people to live in deliberately substandard conditions, while being ruled by someone specifically chosen for incompetence. The vault was never completed before the bombs fell, so the experiment never took place. The unfinished facility was later used as a base by criminals, and Detective Nick Valentine was found imprisoned there during Fallout 4. The incomplete construction means we'll never know exactly how the class warfare experiment would have played out. But the design documents show that Vault-Tec understood class dynamics well enough to deliberately engineer conflict between social groups. The experiment would have studied whether wealthy people could adapt to poverty, or whether their privileged backgrounds would make them incapable of surviving in harsh conditions. It was basically social Darwinism disguised as research. The fact that this vault was planned shows how thoroughly Vault-Tec understood and was willing to exploit American social tensions for experimental purposes. They recognized that class conflict was a reliable source of human suffering that could be weaponized for research. But while Vault 114 focused on economic class differences, Vault 118 extended that concept by forcing the ultra-wealthy to live as immortal robot brains. Vault 118, designed as a two-wing facility for testing social interactions between ultra-wealthy and working-class residents, Vault 118 was supposed to study class conflict in confined conditions. But funding issues meant only the luxury wing was completed, leaving the working-class wing unbuilt and stranding the wealthy residents without their intended social counterparts. Rather than abandon the experiment, the wealthy residents chose to become robo-brains to survive indefinitely in their luxury accommodations. They voluntarily transferred their consciousness into robotic bodies, essentially choosing immortality over death but trapping themselves in mechanical forms. The Overseer was left to manage immortal robot aristocrats without any working-class residents to provide the intended social conflict. The Vault basically became a twisted version of class privilege, where the wealthy achieved literal immortality while the poor were simply excluded from the experiment entirely. The RoboBrain residents retained their personalities, memories, and social attitudes, but they were stuck in mechanical bodies and confined to their luxury prison forever. Vault 118 shows how Vault-Tec's experiments could create unintended consequences that lasted for centuries, because the RoboBrain residents couldn't die and couldn't leave. The Vault demonstrates how technology intended to preserve human life could become a form of eternal imprisonment when combined with social inequality. But while Vault 118 accidentally created immortal prisoners, Vault 120 represents the kind of ambitious experimental design that never made it into the actual games. Vault 120? This underwater vault in Massachusetts Bay was planned to feature a giant squid overseer and would have included submarine travel, underwater exploration, and Bioshock-inspired themes with aquatic creatures. The vault was cut from Fallout 4 during development, so it never appeared in the final game and we don't know what the experiment would have involved. The concept art and design documents suggest an underwater facility that would have tested human adaptation to aquatic environments. possibly studying whether people could develop new survival skills in completely alien surroundings. The giant squid overseer implies that the experiment would have involved non-human intelligence or genetic manipulation to create aquatic adaptations. Vault 120 represents the kind of creative experimental design that Vault-Tec might have implemented if they had unlimited resources and complete disregard for human safety. An underwater vault would be incredibly dangerous and difficult to escape, making it perfect for experiments that required complete isolation from the surface world. The fact that this vault was designed but never implemented shows how many horrific experiments Vault-Tec might have conducted if they had more time, resources, and development budget. The cut content suggests that the corporation's imagination for human experimentation was essentially unlimited. Looking at every vault across the entire Fallout series reveals the true scope of Vault-Tec's crimes against humanity. These weren't shelters that failed due to technical problems or resource shortages. They were deliberately designed laboratories where human beings were tortured, murdered, and experimented on for data that would ultimately serve the Enclave's plan to abandon Earth entirely. Only 17 of the 122 vaults were genuine shelters, meaning Vault-Tec condemned over 100,000 people to death and suffering while pretending to save them. The vaults show how completely institutional evil can corrupt even the most basic human needs for safety and community. Vault-Tec used people's natural desire to protect their families as a weapon against them, turning parental love into a delivery mechanism for children to experimental facilities. They exploited American cultural values like democracy, competition, and self-reliance as tools for psychological manipulation and social control. Most horrifically, the vaults prove that the technology existed to actually save humanity and rebuild civilization. Vault 8, Vault 76, and other control vaults show that the shelters could have worked if Vault-Tec had actually wanted to preserve human life rather than exploit it. The corporation had the resources, knowledge, and capability to create 122 genuine havens for rebuilding society, but they chose to build 105 torture chambers instead. These are the 7 levels of Fallout vaults. Level 1, Trash Vaults. These are the boring ones, the ones that actually worked like advertised. Out of 122 vaults built across America, only 17 were straight-up normal shelters where people could ride out the apocalypse without Vault-Tec pulling some twisted experiment. Places like Vault 8 and Vault 76 fall into this category. They got their GX terraforming kits, their water chips didn't mysteriously fail, nobody was secretly dosing the air supply with hallucinogens, and they weren't filled with a man named Gary. Vault 8 in Nevada is the poster child here. It only opened 4 years later than it was supposed to. The dwellers used their Garden of Eden creation kit to terraform the wasteland, and boom, they founded Vault City by 2091. The place became this weirdly functional post-apocalyptic settlement with actual infrastructure and governance. Vault 76 in West Virginia is another control vault, the one you start in during Fallout 76. It was designed to open exactly 25 years after the bombs dropped on Reclamation Day, and it actually did. No weird twists or surprise cannibalism, just a bunch of people walking out into the wasteland to rebuild America like the brochures promised. These vaults matter because they prove Vault-Tec could have saved people if they wanted to. They had the technology and resources to build genuine Fallout shelters, but instead they chose to run sick experiments on 105 of the 122 vaults they constructed. But here's the thing, if Vault-Tec could build 17 working vaults, why make 105 death traps? Keep that question in mind, because the answer isn't what you think. Now let's see what happened when they started testing isolation. Level 2, Isolation Vaults. This level is where Vault-Tec started testing how humans handle being completely cut off from everything. Vault 101 from Fallout 3 is the most famous example. The tagline was literally Vault 101, Jewel of the Wastes, but the real experiment was that nobody was ever supposed to leave, ever. The Overseer had standing orders to keep that vault sealed indefinitely, and anyone who even talked about opening the door was labeled a dissident. Your character's dad breaking this rule by escaping to find a water purifier is what kicks off the entire main quest of Fallout 3. Vault 13 from the original Fallout also falls here, though with a different spin. It was designed to stay sealed for 200 years to study prolonged isolation, but their water chip conveniently failed after just a few decades, forcing them to send someone out into the wasteland. That someone becomes the Vault Dweller, the protagonist of the first game, who has to trek across California looking for replacement parts. The whole water chip failure might have been intentional sabotage by Vault-Tec, Tech to see what happens when isolated communities face extinction-level equipment failures. Vault 21 in New Vegas took isolation in a weird direction by making everything inside decided by gambling. Every dispute, every decision, every allocation of resources came down to games of chance. It worked surprisingly well until Mr. House showed up and won the vault in a game of blackjack, then filled most of it with concrete. The isolation experiments reveal Vault Tech's obsession with control and obedience. They wanted to know if they could create perfectly insulated societies that would follow orders without question. Communities so indoctrinated they'd never challenge authority even when it meant their own doom. These vaults often developed cult-like social structures where the overseer was basically a dictator and questioning the system was heresy. The psychological damage from these experiments lasted generations, creating societies that couldn't adapt when they finally did open and face the real wasteland. But isolation was just psychology. What comes next is where Vault Tech started weaponizing human needs themselves, and one vault proves they'd even weaponize people's recovery just to watch them destroy each other. Level 3. Survival Experiments. Now, Vault Tech wanted to see what happens when you give people just barely enough, or way too much of something specific. Vault 34 is the perfect example of too much. This vault near Vegas was stuffed with an absolutely insane amount of weapons and ammunition, way more than any civilian shelter would ever need. The experiment was basically what happens when everyone has unlimited access to guns in a confined space. Spoiler alert, they formed armed factions, fought over the reactor, and when it leaked radiation, most of them died. The survivors became the Boomers, that artillery-obsessed faction at Nellis Air Force Base who shoot at literally anyone who gets close. Vault 22 tested resource scarcity from a different angle, focusing on food production. They were experimenting with mutated plant spores to create fast-growing crops, which sounds genius until you learn the spores turned people into hostile plant zombie things. The scientists kept pushing their experiments even as dwellers started transforming, and eventually the whole vault became overrun with these spore carriers. You explore this nightmare in New Vegas, fighting through fungus-infected tunnels and mutated plants while reading terminal entries about how the scientists knew exactly what was happening and kept going anyway. Vault 95 weaponized addiction and recovery. It was advertised as a rehabilitation facility for chem addicts, a clean space where people could get sober and stay sober. For 5 years it actually worked. People kicked their habits and built a supportive community. Then, as planned, Vault Tech had a plan to open a secret stash of chems in the walls. The resulting relapse destroyed everything. Dwellers turned on each other and the vault fell apart. When you find it in Fallout 4, it's occupied by gunners who are using it as a base, completely unaware of the deliberately engineered tragedy that happened there. These experiments were Vault Tech's way of studying human behavior under extreme conditions, specifically how societies function when basic needs become weapons. The data they collected was supposedly for planning long-term space colonization, figuring out minimum resource requirements for generation ships or Mars colonies, but really it was just corporate-funded sadism dressed up as science, watching people suffer for spreadsheets and graphs, or so it seemed, because every experiment was teaching Vault Tech something specific about human breaking points. The question is, why did they need to know? Level 4. Social Experiment. This is where Vault Tech crossed a different line. They weren't just studying how people break. They were discovering how to make people build entire societies around their own destruction. Vault 11 proves it, and what the computer told the last 5 survivors reveals exactly what Vault Tech learned about human nature. Vault 11 is hands down one of the darkest experiments in the entire franchise. The Vault's computer told residents they had to sacrifice one person every year or everyone would die. They developed this whole electoral system where they'd vote for an overseer who would then be executed. Candidates used propaganda, bribery, and blackmail to avoid winning. Voting blocks formed, people manipulated elections, and this went on for years until one election cycle failed and only 5 people remained. They refused to sacrifice anyone, and when they finally told the computer no, it revealed the whole thing was a test and they'd actually passed by refusing. But by then, 4 of them killed each other in the aftermath, and only one survived, completely broken. That's the discovery Vault Tech was after. Give humans the right rules, and they'll create systems that destroy them without question. They'll accept authority even when it's killing them. This data was worth everything to someone. But who? Vault 118 up in Far Harbor ran a class experiment. They divided the vault into sectors for rich elites and poor workers, but the workers section was never completed, so it ended up being just 10 ultra-wealthy people isolated together, and they eventually transferred their consciousnesses into robot bodies to achieve immortality. When you arrive, they're still there as these brainbots, completely unaware that centuries have passed and they're essentially digital ghosts acting out their pre-war aristocratic fantasies. Vault 19 in the Mojave tested paranoia by deliberately dividing dwellers into 2 groups, red and blue, and giving them separate sections of the vault. The computer systems were rigged to make each side think the other was sabotaging them. Subliminal messages, fake alerts, manipulated supply counts, all designed designed to manufacture conflict where none existed. Eventually, both groups abandoned the vault rather than fight, which is almost a happy ending by Vault-Tec standards. Vault 112 might be the cruelest. Dr. Braun, the Overseer, trapped everyone in virtual reality pods running a simulation he controlled. For over 200 years, he's been psychologically torturing them, forcing them to live through scenario after scenario where he plays God. They can't die, can't escape, just endless cycles of whatever twisted narrative Braun feels like inflicting. Your interaction with this vault in Fallout 3 involves entering the simulation, and either helping the residents escape or helping Braun torture them more. Because even the player isn't safe from these moral nightmares. The social experiments prove Vault-Tec understood human psychology well enough to break it systematically. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully designed scenarios testing specific hypotheses about authority, conformity, and social collapse. The Enclave wanted this data for colonization projects, figuring out exactly how much stress a closed society could handle before fracturing. Level 5. Evolution experiments. Everything up to now was psychology and social control, but these next vaults reveal something darker. Vault-Tec wasn't trying to save humanity. They were trying to replace it, and in Vault 87, they actually succeeded. Vault 87 sits at the top of this category. This vault in the Capital Wasteland wasn't a shelter at all. It was a research facility testing the forced evolutionary virus. They were supposed to study FEV effects on human subjects, but study quickly became mass mutation experiment. Nearly every dweller was transformed into super mutants, those giant green monsters that populate the Capital Wasteland. The vault became ground zero for the East Coast super mutant population, and you can find it in Fallout 3, still crawling with mutants and radiation so intense that approaching from certain directions will kill you instantly. One of the few survivors who kept his mind is Fox, the super mutant companion you can recruit who was intelligent enough to realize what happened and hates Vault-Tec for it. Vault 92 ran audio-based mind control experiments. They filled this vault with musicians, supposedly to preserve performing arts through the apocalypse. But the real plan involved subliminal messaging hidden in white noise played constantly through the vault's speaker system. The messages were supposed to create super soldiers by conditioning extreme aggression and obedience to commands. Instead, everyone went violently insane, killing each other in brutal rampages. When you explore it in Fallout 3, you find terminal entries from a violinist who slowly realizes the music is changing him, making him angry and violent, but he can't stop it or escape. Vault 96 in Fallout 76 was sold as an animal preservation project, basically Noah's Ark for wasteland creatures. What residents didn't know was that Vault-Tec was using them to test aggressive mutation serums on the animals. They had quotas for genetic modifications, pushing mutations harder and faster to see what would happen. Predictably, the creatures became unstable and dangerous, and after the dwellers died to the Vault's mainframe activating a superseding security protocol during their failed escape attempt, the mutated creatures escaped. The specimens went into Appalachia, which explains some of the more horrifying mutated wildlife you encounter. Vault 75. Beneath a middle school ran a eugenics program focused on children. Kids were separated from parents on entry, told their families died, and raised in an underground facility that constantly tested them through brutal competition. The weakest were reclaimed, which Vault-Tec speaks of being murdered and harvested for genetic material. The strongest were bred to create perfect specimens. The scientists pushed this for generations until the teenagers eventually figured it out and revolted, killing all the researchers. You can explore this vault in Fallout 4 and read the heartbreaking terminal entries from both the kids and the scientists who rationalized atrocity as progress. Each experiment maps perfectly to a specific problem, but what problem were they solving? That's next. These biological experiments represent Vault-Tec at its most callous, treating human life as raw material for science. The goal was ostensibly to understand genetic manipulation and create enhanced humans for space colonization, but the methods were straight out of the worst moments in human history. Eugenics programs and unethical medical experimentation cranked up to apocalyptic extremes. Level 6. Experimental vaults. These vaults tested one final variable: minimum viable systems. How little technology do you need to keep humans alive in a closed environment? Because if you're noticing that every experiment sounds like preparation for something, you're right, and what comes after this explains everything. Vault 88, which you can explore and build in Fallout 4's DLC, was designed to test prototype Vault-Tec technologies on unwitting subjects. The Overseer, who survived as a ghoul, was working on devices like exercise bikes that drained life force, soda machines that dispensed chems, and slot machines rigged for behavior modification. The Vault was never finished before the bomb bombs dropped, so the experiments never ran at full scale. But you can choose to complete them yourself or sabotage the Overseer's plans and make the technology actually helpful. Vault 114 took a different approach, experimenting with leadership structures through architecture. This vault beneath a subway station in Boston was deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. The Overseer's room was a transparent office in the middle of everything with zero privacy, and the whole vault was built to create constant tension between authority figures and residents. The idea was to test if leaders could maintain control when they had no special privileges or private space. Construction never finished before the war, so the experiment never ran, but the criminal Skinny Malone moved in and made it his headquarters in Fallout 4. Vault 108 had a cloning lab because Vault-Tec wanted to know what happens when you can mass-produce humans. The Overseer was terminally ill, and the plan was to clone one resident named Gary over and over to study hive mind dynamics and identity degradation. Instead, the Garys gained sentience as a collective, realized they were being used, and turned on everyone else. By the time you reach this vault in Fallout 3, it's entirely populated by hostile Gary clones who can only say their own name, creating this deeply unsettling atmosphere where every enemy is the same person copied hundreds of times. Vault 106 tested chemical warfare technology through psychoactive drugs pumped into the ventilation system. The gas was supposed to induce hallucinations and paranoia, which it absolutely did. 10 days after the vault sealed, dwellers started experiencing vivid hallucinations and violent delusions. The vault descended into chaos as people attacked hallucinations that looked like their friends and family. Centuries later, when you explore it, the gas is still active, causing the lone wanderer to hallucinate during exploration, seeing fake enemies and distorted versions of reality. The technology experiments show Vault-Tec's complete disregard for safety protocols or ethics. They were testing prototype devices that should have gone through decades of trials, instead throwing them into live environments with real people. The Enclave wanted data on cutting-edge tech for their projects, and Vault-Tec was happy to provide it regardless of cost. These vaults often left behind functioning but dangerous technology that Wastelanders stumbled into, creating new threats centuries after the original experiments ended. Level 7. Legendary Vaults. Here's what every single experiment was actually for. Vault-Tec and the Enclave weren't preparing to survive nuclear war, they were preparing to leave Earth entirely. According to Fallout's co-creator Tim Kaine, Vault-Tec and the Enclave designed these experiments to gather data for an interstellar colonization project. They believed Earth might become completely uninhabitable, and wanted to understand how humans would survive on generation ships traveling to other planets. Every experiment tested a different variable relevant to space travel. Isolation mirrors deep space missions, resource scarcity reflects limited ship supplies, social engineering explores governance and closed systems, biological experiments prepare for alien environments, and technology tests determine minimum viable systems. The Enclave, remnants of the US government, monitored all the vaults from remote locations, collecting data transmitted from each Overseer. They planned to USC this research to select the strongest survivors for their ARC project if Earth truly became unlivable. The vaults were essentially massive lab rats, with 105 out of 122 facilities running some kind of experiment, while the 17 control vaults provided baseline data. The vaults were never shelters. They were simulations of generation ships, and every person who walked into one thinking they'd be saved became a test subject for humanity's escape plan. But here's where it gets even darker. Vault-Tec sold this to the government by framing it as necessary preparation for humanity's survival, the ultimate contingency plan that required extreme measures. The Fallout TV series that dropped in 2024 adds another layer to this. It reveals Vault-Tec executives meeting before the war, discussing their experiments and plans. Vaults 31 through 33 form a connected system where Vault 31 holds cryogenically frozen Vault-Tec management who periodically wake up to oversee and manipulate the other two vaults, essentially creating a perpetual corporation that outlives the apocalypse. The show hints that Vault-Tec might have had a hand in starting the Great War itself, ensuring their vaults would be needed and their experiments could proceed. While that's not confirmed in game canon, it fits the pattern of corporate evil that defines Vault-Tec's legacy. What makes this endgame truly disturbing is the scale of the lie. Vault-Tec spent billions of dollars, involved thousands of employees, and built 122 facilities, all while maintaining the facade of salvation. The advertising, the Vault Boy mascot giving thumbs up, the cheerful instructional videos about surviving atomic war, it was all marketing for the largest unethical human experiment in history. Families bought into this promise of safety, paid for vault spots, and walked into their assigned shelters thinking they'd secured their future. Instead, they became test subjects in scenarios designed to break them. The data collected from these experiments supposedly justified the suffering, providing insights into human psychology and society under extreme stress. But even if the Enclave used this information for space colonization, it doesn't change what happened to the people trapped in vaults, living their entire lives as unwitting participants in someone else's grand design. Vault survivors who emerged into the wasteland, either because their vault failed or succeeded, spread across America and influenced the formation of major factions. The new California Republic traces its roots to vault dwellers. The Brotherhood of Steel interacted with vault technology constantly, and super mutants from vault experiments shaped entire regions. The Vault-Tec Corporation itself was deeply embedded in pre-war America, with university campuses, demonstration vaults, and promotional centers spreading their brand. Vault-Tec University in Fallout 76 was a training facility for Vault personnel, but even there, Vault-Tec ran experiments, starving the students to test emergency rationing protocols. The Demonstration Vault in Los Angeles, which appears in Fallout 1, was meant to show off Vault technology to potential customers, but later became the master's base of operations, proving that even Vault-Tec's public relations efforts came back to haunt the wasteland. Vault-Tec didn't fail, they succeeded. Every experiment proved what they wanted to know: humans adapt. We suffer, obey, rebuild, and survive. Even after centuries of cruelty, their systems still echo through the wasteland. Vault 111. This is where most modern fans first discovered that Vault-Tec was lying to everyone, and it's the perfect introduction to just how deep this conspiracy goes. You play as the sole survivor who enters what you think is a temporary decontamination shelter, only to be frozen in cryogenic pods for 200 years while watching your spouse get murdered and your son kidnapped. The Vault was advertised as a short-term safety measure, but was actually a long-term experiment in cryogenic preservation, using unwitting test subjects. Vault 111 serves as most players' first real understanding that every vault door hides a different horror, and the people promising to save you are often the ones planning to experiment on you. But this cryogenic betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg compared to the systematic psychological torture happening elsewhere. Vault 101. This vault established the no one enters, no one leaves rule under complete dictatorial overseer control, creating a permanent prison disguised as a safety shelter. The vault number itself references George Orwell's 1984, Room 101, where people are sent for re-education, showing that Vault-Tec's designers were well aware they were creating totalitarian nightmares. Residents lived under absolute authoritarian control for generations, with the overseer maintaining power through isolation and information control. The Vault demonstrates how easily protection can become imprisonment when those in charge have unlimited authority and no oversight. If you thought permanent dictatorship was bad, the next revelation shows the true scope of Vault-Tec's deception. Vault-Tec Corporation. The Fallout TV show finally confirmed what fans suspected for decades. Vault-Tec didn't just profit from nuclear war, they actively orchestrated it. Corporate executives are shown plotting to drop the first nuclear bombs themselves to ensure their Vault experiments could proceed and guarantee their post-war dominance. This transforms every single Vault experiment, from cruel science into part of a master plan for corporate control of post-apocalyptic America. Vault-Tec had billions invested in underground facilities and human experimentation that could only be justified if civilization actually collapsed, making nuclear holocaust a business necessity. But even knowing Vault-Tec started the war, the real horror is how few people they actually intended to save. Control vaults. Out of 122 vaults constructed across America, only 17 were legitimate shelters designed to function as advertised, meaning 88% of Vault-Tec's safety shelters were actually torture chambers. This reveals the staggering scope of deception, where nearly every family that thought they were being saved was actually being fed to human experimentation programs. The control vaults served as baseline data for comparison against the experimental horrors, but they also provided Vault-Tec with a small population of normal humans for whatever post-war plans they had in mind. The numbers prove that Vault-Tec viewed the American population as expendable test subjects, rather than people worthy of rescue. While these surface revelations are disturbing, they're nothing compared to the specific horrors conducted in individual vaults. Vault 87. This vault conducted systematic FEV testing by locking residents in chambers and exposing them to forced evolutionary virus, while scientists observed their mutations from behind safety glass. Within 2 weeks, most subjects died in agony from the transformation process, while survivors became the super mutants that would terrorize the capital wasteland for centuries. The experiment continued for years, with scientists documenting every stage of human transformation into hulking, often mentally impaired creatures. Vault 87 represents the ultimate violation of medical ethics, turning an entire community into unwilling test subjects for biological weapons research. But if you thought biological experimentation was the worst thing humans could do to each other, the next vault weaponized democracy itself. Vault 11. This experiment represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating manipulation in the entire Vault network. Residents were told they must democratically vote to sacrifice one person annually, or everyone in the Vault would be killed by the computer systems. For years, they held elections that were essentially murder campaigns, where people tried to nominate their enemies for death while the community tore itself apart through betrayal and political manipulation. The ultimate horror came when the final 5 survivors refused to continue the sacrifices, only to learn the computer was lying and actually congratulated them for making the right choice by not killing anybody. The Vault proved that even democracy can be perverted into a tool for systematic murder when authority figures control the information. While democratic murder was psychologically devastating, the next Vault trapped people in an even more personal hell. Vault 112. Dr. Stanislaus Braun trapped 85 residents in virtual reality pods for over 200 years, forcing them to endure psychological torture in his Tranquility Lane simulation for his personal amusement. The residents experienced repeated death and trauma within the simulation while being unable to truly die, creating perfect conditions for infinite psychological torture. Braun treated human consciousness like his personal video game, resetting scenarios whenever he got bored and subjecting people to whatever sadistic fantasies he could imagine. The Vault represents the ultimate fusion of technology and cruelty, where a single sociopathic scientist could torment dozens of people for centuries without consequence. If you thought virtual reality torture was sophisticated evil, the next Vault took a more direct biological approach. Vault 22. The agricultural experiment with plant spores went horrifically wrong when the enhanced vegetation turned residents into undead plant-human hybrid creatures called spore crawlers. The Vault's research into hardy, radiation-resistant crops created something far more sinister when the plants began using human hosts for reproduction and survival. Survivors became shambling horrors that were part human, part plant, and completely hostile to any remaining uninfected humans. The Vault shows how even beneficial research, like improving food production, can become a biological nightmare when conducted without proper safety protocols. But these well-documented horrors are just the surface level of what Vault-Tec was willing to do to people. Vault 27. This overcrowding experiment deliberately housed 2 zero people in space designed for 1 0, studying the psychological and social effects of extreme overcrowding in a sealed environment. The Vault was designed to create constant resource shortages, interpersonal conflicts, and claustrophobic conditions that would drive residents to violence and desperation. The experiment exists primarily in reference materials, but it represents one of Vault-Tec's most straightforward approaches to human suffering through simple mathematical cruelty. By doubling the population and keeping resources constant, they guaranteed that every day would be a struggle for survival even without external threats. While overcrowding was simple, mathematical cruelty, the next experiments used gender as a weapon. Vault 68 and Vault 69. These twin experiments in sexual dynamics placed 999 men with 1 woman in Vault 68 and 999 women with 1 man in Vault 69. The vaults were designed to study how extreme gender imbalances would create social chaos, sexual competition, and psychological trauma for everyone involved. The lone individual of each gender faced impossible pressure and exploitation, while the majority competed desperately for attention, resources, and reproductive rights. These experiments show how Vault-Tec was willing to use basic human biology and social dynamics as tools for systematic psychological torture. But if you thought gender manipulation was disturbing, the next Vault created an army of mentally damaged clones. Vault 108. The cloning experiment created 54 copies of original resident Gary, while deliberately designing leadership conflicts through terminal cancer for the Overseer and failing power systems. The Gary clones were mentally stunted and programmed with limited vocabulary, eventually going insane and escaping their chambers to cannibalize the entire Vault staff. The Vault became filled with dozens of deranged clones wandering the halls, endlessly repeating Gary, while surrounded by the bones of the scientists who created them. The experiment represents Vault-Tec's willingness to play God with human reproduction, while demonstrating complete disregard for the psychological welfare of their artificial humans. While cloning created physical horror, the next Vault weaponized art itself. Vault 92. This experiment housed musicians who were exposed to white noise and hypnotic frequencies designed to make them violent through subliminal psychological manipulation. The Vault tested whether creativity and artistic expression could be controlled and weaponized through sound-based brainwashing techniques. The audio manipulation eventually drove residents to madness and violence, turning artists into killers while proving that even humanity's most beautiful expressions could be perverted into tools of control. The experiment shows how Vault-Tec viewed every aspect of human culture as potential ammunition for their psychological warfare research. But if you thought weaponizing music was twisted, the next vault used paranoia as a surgical instrument. Vault 19. This paranoia induction experiment divided residents into red and blue sectors with separate overseers, using subliminal messaging, flickering lights, strange drafts, falsified medical records, and limited water supplies to create artificial distrust. Red residents believed blues were poisoning them, while blues thought reds were sabotaging resources, creating escalating conflicts that tore the community apart. The experiment was technically a failure because the vault's location above sulfur deposits created real paranoia symptoms like headaches and nausea, making it a chemical rather than non-chemical means of inducing paranoia. The vault demonstrates how easily people can be manipulated into hating each other over completely fabricated differences when authority figures control the information flow. These documented experiments represent just the vaults that made it into the final games, but the cut content reveals even darker possibilities. Vault 120. Todd Howard confirmed this cut Fallout 4 content would have featured a BioShock-style underwater vault with a massive, sentient octopus living outside the facility. The underwater vault would have combined claustrophobia, isolation, and the constant threat of a giant intelligent predator that could potentially breach the facility at any time. This cut content shows how much darker and more ambitious Fallout 4's vault experiments originally were before being scaled back for the final release. The concept demonstrates that Vault-Tec's imagination for human suffering extended even to the ocean floor. While underwater horror was cut from the final game, other cancelled vaults explored different forms of family destruction. Vault 29. From the cancelled Van Buren Fallout 3, this vault only admitted children under 15 years old, permanently separating them from their parents, who were sent to different facilities. The experiment was designed to study child development without adult guidance, while using the trauma of family separation as a psychological variable. Children would have been raised by AI systems while never knowing what happened to their parents or siblings, creating a generation of psychologically damaged individuals. This family separation experiment represents pure cruelty, disguised as developmental psychology research. If you thought separating families was evil, the next vault added wild animals to make survival even more impossible. Vault 43. This survival horror scenario locked 20 men, 10 women, and 1 panther together to study how desperate humans would react to a deadly predator in their living space. The experiment exists only in reference materials, but represents Vault-Tec's willingness to use apex predators as experimental variables in human behavior studies. Residents would have faced the constant threat of being killed and eaten while trying to maintain some form of civilization in an impossibly dangerous environment. The Vault shows how Vault-Tec viewed both humans and animals as disposable components in their twisted scientific experiments. But the released games contained even more sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. Vault 75. Hidden beneath Malden Middle School, this eugenics experiment only admitted children under 15 while immediately executing all adults upon entry. Children underwent rigorous physical training and combat drills while being told they were preparing for UPTOPLAND, but at age 18 they were sorted into 3 categories. Genetically superior children had their genetic material harvested, then were killed. Intellectually superior but physically weak children were recruited as scientists, and inferior children were executed immediately. A child named Rohit discovered classified papers and organized a successful uprising with James and Alma, aided by Washington, a former resident turned scientist who had grown attached to the younger children. When players arrive, only gunner mercenaries and skeletons in Vault-Tec uniforms remain as evidence of this systematic child harvesting operation. While child harvesting was openly murderous, the next vault used false hope as a weapon. Vault 81. This vault was designed to test experimental pathogens on residents using mole rats as carriers, but Overseer Olivet discovered the secret lab and locked the scientists inside, allowing residents to live normally for over 200 years. When the sole survivor arrives, a child named Austin accidentally enters the hidden lab and contracts mole rat disease, which causes permanent health damage and can only be cured with a single Vault 81 cure found in the lab. This creates one of Fallout 4's most difficult moral choices, where players must decide whether to save themselves or save the child, showing how even subverted Vault experiments continue to create ethical dilemmas centuries later. If you thought moral dilemmas were cruel, the next Vault deliberately destroyed people who had overcome their worst problems. Vault 95. Located in the glowing sea, this vault housed 72 former chem addicts who were successfully rehabilitated over 5 years with no access to drugs. After 5 years of sobriety and recovery, a hidden stash of psycho and other chems was automatically unlocked, and the vault descended into chaos as residents murdered each other for drugs. The experiment proved that psychological addiction persists even after physical recovery, making recovery meaningless when temptation returns. By 2287, the vault is overrun by gunners, and Kate's companion companion quest involves using the Vault's clean room technology to cure her addiction, though this only addresses physical dependence. But Vault-Tec's cruelty extended beyond just psychological manipulation to deliberate radiation exposure. Vault 12. Built beneath Bakersfield with a vault door designed not to close properly, this experiment deliberately exposed residents to radiation to study long-term effects on human physiology. Most residents became ghouls and eventually founded Necropolis under the leadership of Set, who drove out the original human overseer. In Fallout 1, players must retrieve the water chip from this vault, but doing so cuts off Necropolis's water supply, forcing players to choose between saving their own vault or helping the ghoul community survive. The vault represents one of Vault-Tec's most straightforward biological experiments, with lasting consequences for the entire wasteland. While radiation exposure was scientifically brutal, the next vault used social class as a torture device. Vault 114, advertised as luxury accommodations for Boston's upper class, this vault was actually built with shared dormitory-style rooms, communal bathrooms, no luxury amenities, and Soup Canhary, a paranoid homeless man, as the designated overseer. The experiment was designed to study how wealthy elites would cope with sudden loss of privilege and authority, forcing them to live in conditions worse than most lower-class housing. The vault was never completed due to the bombs falling early, ironically saving the wealthy residents from Vault-Tec's class warfare experiment. When players arrive, it's overrun by Triggermen holding Nick Valentine captive. If you thought class warfare experiments were sophisticated, the next vault let artificial intelligence conduct its own sadistic research. Vault 51. This Appalachian vault was overseen by a ZAX supercomputer tasked with selecting the perfect overseer through competitive elimination, forcing residents into increasingly violent challenges while the AI observed and manipulated them. The computer would pit residents against each other until only one remained, treating human life as variables in its twisted selection algorithm. Evidence suggests residents eventually discovered Zax's manipulation and rebelled, with bodies found throughout the vault showing various causes of death as some fought while others committed suicide rather than participate. 2 vault dwellers rigged the door mechanism to permanently seal the vault from outside, trapping the murderous AI inside with the consequences of its experiment. But Vault-Tec also conducted experiments with legitimate purposes that still went horribly wrong. Vault 79. This vault stored the entire U.S. gold reserve under Secret Service protection, with the vault number 79 corresponding to gold's atomic number on the periodic table. While this represented one of the few vaults with a legitimate protective purpose rather than an experiment, reactor failure turned half the Secret Service into feral ghouls, trapping the survivors for months without supplies. The vault shows how even Vault-Tec's non-experimental facilities became death traps through poor maintenance and design flaws, proving that the company's incompetence was as dangerous as their deliberate cruelty. While most vaults are well documented, some exist only as mysterious references in terminal entries. Burkittsville Vault. This Maryland vault appears only in a Fallout 3 terminal entry stating that it wouldn't open its doors and became surrounded by cannibals who killed anyone trying to reach it. The vault represents one of the series' unsolved mysteries where we know something horrible happened, but the specific details remain hidden. The terminal entry suggests the vault may have been conducting experiments so disturbing that the residents chose to remain sealed inside rather than face the outside world. Whether the cannibals were failed vault dwellers, outside raiders, or something worse remains a terrifying unknown. But the deepest level of Vault lore goes beyond individual experiments to reveal the conspiracy behind everything. Vault-Tec started the war. This fan theory existed for decades based on Vault-Tec logos found on unexploded bombs in game files, but the Fallout TV show finally confirmed it in 2024. The series showed Vault-Tec executives actively plotting to drop nuclear weapons themselves, because they had billions invested in vault construction and human experimentation that could only be justified by actual nuclear apocalypse. The revelation recontextualizes the entire Fallout universe, transforming the Great War from a tragic accident into a deliberate corporate decision to murder hundreds of millions of people for profit. Vault-Tec didn't just prepare for nuclear war, they caused it to protect their investment and ensure their post-war dominance. While the corporate conspiracy was hidden for decades, some Easter eggs were hiding in plain sight. The real Vault-Tec phone number. During Fallout 4's release, 1-888 Vault-Tec was actually callable and played a recorded message saying, "Due to unexpectedly high call volume, all representatives are busy. There are 101 million callers ahead of you. directly referencing Vault 101. The phone number was a real marketing stunt that let players interact with Vault-Tec as if it were a real company, complete with the kind of customer service runaround that makes you want to hang up immediately. The message's reference to 101 million callers was both a joke about customer service hell and a hint that Vault-Tec viewed the entire American population as potential customers for their death traps. But the phone number was just one of many hidden meanings embedded throughout the series. Hidden Vault Number Meanings. The Vault numbering system reveals multiple layers of organizational psychology that reward deep analysis. Vault 13 uses an unlucky number and suffers the water chip failure that drives the original game's plot, while Vault 21 references blackjack and is located on the Strip in New Vegas. Vault 69 contains an obvious sexual reference that matches its gender experiment, while Vault 76 references 1776 and serves as America's tricentennial vault. Vault 79 uses gold's atomic number and stores the U.S. gold reserves, while Vault 101 represents binary for 5, making it the vault for the 5th Fallout game. The numbering pattern reveals that single digits were control vaults in basic experiments, teens focused on social manipulation, 20s, 30s conducted biological experiments, 70s, 90s handled resource management, and 100s plus represented advanced psychological and technological experiments. These numerical patterns connect to something even deeper about the Vault system's true purpose. The TV show Vault Trinity. The Fallout series revealed Vaults 31, 32, and 33 as part of Buds Buds, a breeding program to create the ideal Vault-Tec management class for post-war corporate control. Vault 31 housed cryogenically frozen Vault-Tec executives and managers, while Vaults 32 and 33 contained agricultural communities that would intermarry to maintain genetic diversity. The twist was that all overseers came from Vault 31, with frozen corporate executives being thawed out to assume leadership positions and breed with the agricultural population. Vault 32 discovered the truth about the breeding program approximately 2 years before the show's events, leading to messages like, "We know the truth" and "Death to management" written on walls before the population turned on each other through murder, suicide, and cannibalism. Betty, a Vault 31 executive, covered up the truth by claiming raiders killed everyone, while Vault 33 remained unaware of their role as breeding stock for corporate overlords. But the Vault concept itself was inspired by real-world Cold War paranoia. Real-world inspirations. Fallout's vaults were directly inspired by real Cold War bunkers like Cheyenne Mountain and Raven Rock, massive underground facilities designed to protect government officials and military leaders during nuclear war. However, as historians have noted, nothing like a true Fallout vault, not a multi-generational, self-sufficient underground community designed to house civilian populations for decades, was ever built or seriously contemplated in reality. The vault concept takes real Cold War bunker technology and pushes it to science fiction extremes, creating underground cities that could theoretically function independently for centuries. This shows how Fallout uses recognizable technology as a foundation for exploring much more extreme scenarios about human survival and corporate control. The Enclave connection reveals the ultimate purpose behind all this suffering. The Enclave connection. Van Buren concept material suggested vaults were designed as test chambers for eventual space colonization by the Enclave, though this was never fully canonized in the final games. This would explain the seemingly pointless cruelty of many experiments. Every vault was testing human limits and social dynamics for future off-world colonies, where people would be trapped in small spaces for generations. The space colonization angle transforms the vault experiments from random sadism into systematic research for humanity's expansion beyond Earth. Whether this was Vault-Tec's actual plan or just one of many post-war contingencies, it shows how the company viewed Earth's population as expendable test subjects for grander ambitions that would only benefit the corporate and political elite. The development history reveals something fundamental about how the Vault system evolved. Development meta lore. The Vault experiments weren't part of the original 1997 Fallout and were added by Tim Kaine after Fallout 1's release, when he realized the Vault concept needed more depth and complexity. The original game was designed to use the GURPS system until Steve Jackson Games objected to the violence, forcing creation of the Special system in just 1 week under intense development pressure. This development history shows how the Vault experiments evolved from simple bomb shelters into the elaborate torture chambers that define the series today. The fact that the most iconic element of Fallout lore was essentially an afterthought proves that sometimes the best ideas come from expanding and improving on simple concepts, rather than having everything planned from the beginning. From simple shelters to corporate conspiracy to breeding programs for management classes, the Fallout Vault iceberg reveals how a seemingly straightforward post-apocalyptic premise conceals layer after layer of systematic horror. Each level down exposes more of Vault-Tech's willingness to treat human beings as expendable test subjects in pursuit of scientific knowledge, corporate power, and post-war dominance. The Iceberg format shows how Fallout rewards deep engagement, with casual players seeing adventure and exploration while dedicated fans discover a comprehensive critique of corporate capitalism, government complicity, and the willingness of authority figures to sacrifice entire populations for their own benefit. The Vaults prove that in the Fallout universe, the greatest enemy of humanity was never nuclear war or radiation, but the human capacity for treating other humans as disposable resources in service of abstract goals, whether those goals were scientific advancement, space colonization, corporate profit, or the creation of a compliant management class to rule over the ashes of the old world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Fallout Vault Iceberg and want to see every Fallout state explained, click the video on the screen.